At 46 years old, my wife looked me in the eye and admitted she was pregnant by another man. Her family did not apologize. Instead, her father looked at me and told me to be a man, swallow my pride, and accept another man's child as my own. I stayed completely silent, taking every insult they threw at me. I stayed silent right up until the moment my attorney opened the prenuptial agreement that left her with absolutely nothing. My name is Thomas Callahan. I am 64 years old, and I am a man who believes in the absolute value of hard work. I own a highly successful commercial roofing and steel fabrication business located right here in the heart of Ohio. For more than 40 years, I have built my life with my own two hands. I know the distinct metallic smell of hot steel, the heavy, awkward weight of a commercial roofing truss, and the deep, unrelenting ache in your lower back that comes from a brutal 12-hour shift. I built my company from the ground up, starting with nothing but a single rusted pickup truck and a dented toolbox. Today, it is a multi-million-dollar enterprise that employs dozens of hard-working folks. I poured my blood, sweat, and tears into my business so I could provide a beautiful, comfortable life for my family. I gave my wife Rebecca everything a person could ever desire. She is 46 years old, and we have been married for 12 years. I gave her the sprawling house in the wealthy suburbs, the luxury cars, the expensive vacations, and the high society church-going life she always dreamed of having. I trusted her implicitly. I truly believed we were an unbreakable team. I thought the respect we showed each other was mutual. I was completely wrong. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The Ohio wind was biting and cold, and a heavy icy rain washed over my truck as I finally pulled into the long paved driveway of our home. I had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift at the fabrication yard. We had a massive commercial roofing contract to fulfill for a new shopping center, and I never asked my crew to work harder than I did. I stepped out of my truck, feeling the familiar deep ache in my knees and shoulders. At 64 years old, the manual labor takes a much heavier toll than it used to, but I never complained. My hands were stained with dark grease and fine steel dust. My muscles were screaming for rest. All I wanted in the world was a hot shower, a warm meal, and a quiet, peaceful evening sitting next to my wife. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door and stepped into the grand foyer of our house. The house was unusually quiet. Normally, Rebecca would have the television turned on in the living room, or she would be on the phone chatting enthusiastically with one of her church committee friends. I took off my heavy, mud-caked work boots, leaving them on the mat, and hung up my damp canvas jacket. I walked slowly down the wide hallway toward the kitchen. The soft, warm glow of the custom pendant lights illuminated the massive marble island I had paid a small fortune to install just last year. Rebecca was sitting on one of the high padded stools at the kitchen island. She was not preparing dinner. She was not reading her evening devotionals. She was hunched over with her face buried deeply in her hands, weeping violently. Her shoulders shook with heavy, uncontrollable sobs. My first instinct was pure, absolute panic. I thought someone had died. I thought there had been a terrible, tragic accident involving her father, Charles, or her younger brother, Greg. I rushed over to her, completely forgetting my own physical exhaustion. I placed my calloused hand gently on her trembling shoulder. I asked her what was wrong. I begged her to talk to me and tell me what had happened. Rebecca gasped for air. Her face flushed red and streaked with ruined mascara. She could not speak at first. She just kept sobbing loudly and shaking her head from side to side. Then I saw it. Resting on the polished marble surface of the kitchen island right next to her tightly clenched fists was a small white plastic stick. It had a tiny digital screen. I did not need to pick it up to know what it was. I had seen them before many decades ago. It was a digital pregnancy test. The word pregnant was displayed clearly and unmistakably on the little screen. For a few agonizing seconds, I simply stared at that small piece of plastic. My brain struggled to process the information. Rebecca was 46 years old. We had never actively tried to have children during our 12-year marriage. She had always told me she was perfectly content just being my wife and dedicating her time to her charity events and her church groups. We had built a comfortable life around just the two of us. She finally lifted her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were bloodshot and wide with absolute panic. She took a ragged, breathless gasp and choked out the words. She told me she was pregnant. She said the doctor had confirmed it that very afternoon through a blood test. She was almost 8 weeks along. I stood there perfectly still. I looked down at my hands, the heavy scarred hands that had built roofs to shelter families across the state. The hands that had worked relentlessly day after day to give this woman a life of absolute privilege and safety. Then I looked back into her tear-filled eyes. She did not wait for me to speak. The confession poured out of her in a rushed, desperate flood of frantic words. She grabbed my wrists with her perfectly manicured fingers squeezing tightly. She cried and said she had made a terrible mistake. A horrible, unforgivable mistake. She confessed that she had been weak and foolish. She admitted that she had slept with another man. She swore to me, crying bitterly, that it was only one time. She claimed she had been feeling old and insecure about her age, and this younger man had paid her some flattering attention, and she simply slipped up in a single moment of extreme weakness. She pleaded with me to believe her. She said the younger man meant absolutely nothing to her. He was a terrible mistake that she regretted the instant it happened. But now she was carrying his child, a younger man. She was 46 and I was 64. The cruel, ugly math of the situation hung heavily in the quiet tension of the kitchen. Rebecca slid off the high stool and literally dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor right in front of me. She wrapped her arms tightly around my legs, burying her wet face against my dirty work jeans. She begged me not to leave her. She begged me not to throw her away after all the years we had shared. Then she started laying out her master plan. It was a highly detailed plan she had clearly and meticulously thought through before I even walked through the front door. She looked up at me, her face a mask of calculated desperation. She told me we could fix this together. She said we could easily hide the ugly truth from the world. She reminded me of our prestigious standing in the local community. She brought up my flawless business reputation and her highly respected position on the church leadership board. She said a divorce or a public scandal of this magnitude would destroy everything we had worked so hard to build. It would ruin my good name in the local business community and make us a permanent object of gossip and ridicule. Her voice dropped to a frantic, urgent whisper. She told me we could just tell everyone the baby was a miracle. A beautiful, unexpected blessing from God arriving late in our lives. She said I could sign the birth certificate and officially be the father. No one would ever have to know about the other man. We could raise the child together as a united husband and wife. She promised she would spend the rest of her life making it up to me being the perfect, obedient, and loving wife I deserved. She actually tried to frame her disgusting betrayal as an opportunity for grace. She used our Christian faith as a weapon against me, asking me to find it in my deeply forgiving heart to pardon her as a good Christian man should. She wanted me to smile for the cameras, hand out celebratory cigars to my crew at the steel yard, and proudly raise the child of the man who had violated my marriage bed. While she wept and pleaded, clinging to my legs, my heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The pain of the betrayal was a physical, crushing weight pressing down on my chest. The woman I had loved, provided for, and trusted completely for 12 years, had knowingly allowed another man into her life. But the sheer agony of that heartbreak did not last long. Within seconds, that hot, blinding pain began to cool. It froze solid, turning into an icy, terrifying clarity. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the top of her head. I did not scream. I did not throw things across the kitchen. I did not curse her name. I let her cry and make her desperate, manipulative promises because I knew something she did not know. I possessed a single solitary piece of information that completely unraveled her entire theatrical performance right there on the kitchen floor. 15 years ago, before I ever met Rebecca, my first wife, Sarah, passed away after a long, brutal battle with illness. The grief of losing her was unbearable. During that dark, solitary period of my life, I made a definitive and permanent decision about my future. I went to my doctor, and I had a medical procedure. I had a vasectomy. It was permanent and completely irreversible. I kept the medical records filed away in a secure safety deposit box at the bank. When I started dating Rebecca a few years later, she made it perfectly clear she was not interested in having children. She wanted to travel, dine at fine restaurants, and enjoy a carefree life. Because we were on the exact same page, I never bothered to mention the medical procedure. It never seemed necessary to bring up past medical history when we both entirely agreed on our future. So as I stood in my kitchen, listening to my wife of 12 years swear on everything she held sacred, that this was a one-time mistake, and that we could pretend the child was a miracle baby, I knew with absolute scientific certainty that I could not be the father. I was completely sterile. But more importantly, I knew something else. I knew Rebecca was lying straight to my face about it being a one-time mistake. Women do not confidently present a fully formed long-term plan to pass off a child as their husband's unless they have been deceiving him for a long time. The sheer audacity to ask me to cover up her infidelity to protect her reputation under the guise of saving our marriage was absolutely sickening. My mind raced with 1,000 different thoughts. If she was capable of this level of deception, what else was she hiding from me? If she was bold enough to try and trap me into raising another man's child, what other massive lies had she woven into my life? I realized in that exact moment that I did not know the woman crying at my feet. The pious, loving, church-going wife was a complete fabrication. She was a master manipulator wearing a highly convincing mask. If I confronted her with the truth about my vasectomy right then and there, she would panic. She would immediately change her story. She would scramble to cover her tracks, delete text messages, and hide whatever else she was doing behind my back. I would lose the element of surprise. I would lose my greatest tactical advantage. I needed to know exactly who she was dealing with. I needed to know the identity of the younger man. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went into my personal finances and my business. I have always been a highly tactical man. You do not build a commercial steel empire by reacting blindly to a sudden crisis. You carefully assess the structural integrity you find the weak points, and you dismantle the problem systematically. I decided right then and there that I would play the exact role she so desperately needed me to play. I would be the devastated but pliable older husband. I would let her believe she had successfully manipulated me into compliance. I took a deep, trembling breath, forcing my voice to shake slightly. I reached down and gently took her by the shoulders, pulling her slowly up from the hardwood floor. I looked deep into her tear-stained eyes, acting as though I was a broken man struggling with a heavy, agonizing burden. I told her I was in shock. I said I could not process what she was telling me. I did not agree to her plan, but I did not reject it either. I told her I needed time to think. I needed time to pray and seek guidance. I told her I could not give her a definitive answer tonight. Rebecca let out a long, trembling sigh of relief. She thought my hesitation was a clear sign of weakness. She thought I was already buckling under the intense pressure of the scandal she had threatened me with. She wiped her face and nodded enthusiastically, playing the role of the remorseful sinner seeking redemption. She told me she understood completely. She promised to give me all the space and time I needed. I turned away from her and walked out of the kitchen, leaving my dinner completely untouched. I walked heavily up the stairs to the guest bedroom and firmly closed the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed in the pitch-black room, staring blankly at the wall. My hands were no longer shaking with physical fatigue. They were clenched into tight, solid fists. The fierce anger building inside my chest was cold, calculated, and incredibly precise. I had given Rebecca everything a person could ask for. I had worked until my bones ached to put luxury and comfort in her life. Now she wanted to use my good name, my hard-earned money, and my honor to clean up her filthy mess. She wanted me to be the silent, obedient shield for her and her hidden lover. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. It was late, but I knew my private investigator never stopped working. I had hired him many years ago for complex corporate background checks. He was entirely discreet and ruthlessly efficient. I sent him a brief, encrypted text message asking him to meet me at a small 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town at exactly 6 o'clock the next morning. I lay back on the bed, fully clothed, staring up at the dark ceiling. The silence of the house felt entirely different to me now. It was no longer a safe sanctuary. It was an active crime scene. I listened carefully to the sounds of the house. I could hear the faint sound of the water running in the master bathroom down the hall. Rebecca was probably washing her face, feeling incredibly triumphant that she had survived the initial confrontation. She probably thought the absolute worst was over. She had absolutely no idea that the real storm had not even begun. She had no idea that her older blue-collar husband was not a gullible fool, easily manipulated by tears and religious guilt. She had severely underestimated the very man who provided the expensive roof over her head. I was going to find out every single sordid detail of her hidden life. I was going to expose the arrogant younger man who thought he could take what was rightfully mine. And I was going to meticulously ensure that when the hammer of justice finally fell, it would shatter her completely and entirely. I closed my eyes, focusing on the slow, steady rhythm of my breathing in the dark room. The rules of our marriage had changed permanently, and I was going to win this game. I would let her sleep peacefully tonight. It would be one of the very last peaceful nights she would ever have in her entire life. The pale gray light of a cold Ohio morning crept through the large windows of my kitchen. I had not slept a single minute. I sat alone at the massive marble island, holding a mug of black coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My body felt as heavy as lead. My back and shoulders still throbbed with the deep, lingering pain of yesterday's 12-hour shift at the steel yard. But the physical exhaustion was absolutely nothing compared to the violent storm raging inside my mind. I stared at the empty space where Rebecca had knelt weeping just a few hours earlier. The image of that positive pregnancy test was burned into my retinas. I knew the truth. I knew with absolute scientific certainty that I was completely sterile. The medical records of my vasectomy from 15 years ago were locked safely away in a bank vault. I knew the child growing inside my 46-year-old wife belonged to another man. Yet I had chosen to remain silent. I had chosen to play the part of the stunned, heartbroken older husband. I did this because I needed to see exactly how deep the rot of her deception truly went. I did not have to wait long to find out. The crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway broke the morning silence. I looked out the kitchen window and saw two vehicles pull up side by side. One was a spotless silver luxury sedan. The other was a massive lifted pickup truck with chrome rims. I recognized them instantly. The sedan belonged to Rebecca's father, Charles. The overly expensive truck belonged to her younger brother, Greg, a truck I had personally co-signed for because Greg's credit was an absolute disaster. My chest tightened. Rebecca had not waited to see how I would process her confession. She had not given me a moment to breathe. Instead, she had immediately called in her reinforcements. She had summoned her family to come and finish the job she started last night. The heavy oak front door opened without a knock. They walked into my house as if they held the deed to the property. I stayed seated at the kitchen island, my hands resting flat on the cold marble surface. Rebecca walked in first. She had clearly reapplied her makeup just to ruin it again. Her eyes were red, her shoulders slumped, and she held a crumpled tissue to her nose. She was playing the role of the fragile, repentant sinner to absolute perfection. Right behind her came Charles. He was in his early 70s, a tall, imposing man with thick, perfectly styled silver hair. Charles was a prominent figure in the local church community. He was the kind of man who loved the sound of his own voice while delivering long-winded prayers at Sunday service. He wore a crisp, tailored suit even on a Wednesday morning, projecting an aura of righteous authority. Trailing behind Charles was Greg. Greg was 42 years old, but he still carried himself like an arrogant college student. He worked in the procurement department of my own steel fabrication company. I had given him that job as a favor to Rebecca, despite his severe lack of work ethic and his constant complaining. Greg was wearing a company polo shirt with my business logo stitched over his chest. He had the nerve to walk into my home wearing the brand I built with my blood and sweat, while preparing to defend the woman who had just shattered my life. They did not offer a single word of greeting. They did not ask how I was doing. They marched directly into the living room and took their seats on the expensive custom leather sofas I had purchased. Charles sat directly across from me. He crossed his legs and folded his hands over his knee. He looked at me with an expression of deep, calculated disappointment. It was the look a disappointed father gives a disobedient child. The sheer arrogance of it made my blood run cold. Charles cleared his throat and began to speak. He did not offer an apology on behalf of his daughter. He did not express any shame or regret that Rebecca had violated her sacred marriage vows. Instead, he immediately launched into a polished, well-rehearsed sermon. He spoke in that low, steady, pastoral tone he used to command attention in a crowded room. He told me that we are all sinners in the eyes of the Lord. He said that the devil finds ways to tempt even the most faithful among us. He spoke about Rebecca as if she were a helpless victim of a momentary lapse in judgment. He completely dismissed her prolonged deception and the ultimate betrayal of bringing another man into her bed. He framed her infidelity as a simple human error, an error that required my immediate and unconditional forgiveness. I sat there staring into his cold blue eyes. I did not say a word. I kept my face entirely blank. Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice grew louder, taking on a harsh, demanding edge. He told me that a true marriage is tested in the fires of adversity. He said that this was my ultimate test as a Christian husband. Then he delivered the exact sentence they had clearly scripted before arriving at my house. He looked me dead in the eye and told me to be a man, swallow my pride, and step up for this baby. He actually pointed a finger at me. He demanded that I protect his daughter's reputation and shield her from the cruel gossip of the town. He told me that a real man provides for his family no matter whose blood runs in the child's veins. He demanded that I accept this bastard child as a gift from God and raise it under my roof with my hard-earned money. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his demand echoed through my living room. He was sitting in my house drinking my coffee, demanding that I sacrifice my dignity to cover up his daughter's filthy actions. My knuckles turned white against the marble countertop. Inside my chest, a furnace of rage was burning so hot, I thought it would consume me. I thought about the medical documents locked in my bank vault. I thought about how utterly foolish they all looked trying to force a sterile man to claim a pregnancy as a blessing. But I held my tongue. I needed to hear the rest of their plan. That was when Greg decided to speak. Greg shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair. He did not have his father's booming authority, so he opted for a completely different tactic. Greg shifted the conversation away from faith and morality. He shifted it directly to my business and my finances. Greg leaned forward, resting his soft, uncalloused hands on the glass coffee table. He looked at me with a smug, arrogant expression. He told me that we needed to look at this situation logically and practically. He reminded me that my commercial roofing and steel fabrication company was currently bidding on several massive state contracts. He pointed out that my business relied heavily on my flawless reputation as a dependable, family-oriented community leader. Greg spoke slowly, deliberately, letting his subtle threats hang in the air. He told me that a messy public divorce would be an absolute public relations nightmare. He said the local business community would devour the gossip. He claimed the board of directors and my primary investors would lose faith in my stability. He painted a terrifying picture of my life's work crumbling to the ground over a simple marital dispute. Then Greg delivered the final crushing blow. He lowered his voice and told me that even if I did decide to walk away, the financial ruin would be absolute. He reminded me that Rebecca was my legal wife. He stated with extreme confidence that she was legally entitled to half of everything I owned. He listed my assets right to my face. The sprawling house we were sitting in, the commercial properties, the luxury cars, the millions of dollars in corporate valuation. He told me that if I fought this, the lawyers would drain my accounts, and a judge would grant Rebecca 50% of my entire empire anyway. Plus, she would get massive alimony payments for the rest of my life to support her and the new baby. Greg smiled a thin, nasty little smile. He told me it would be financial suicide to leave her. He said it was far cheaper and much smarter to just keep the peace sign, the birth certificate, and let life continue as normal. I sat in absolute silence, absorbing every single word they threw at me. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. As I looked at the three of them sitting together, a horrifying realization washed over me. The fog of my initial heartbreak completely vanished. This was not just a case of a wife making a foolish mistake. This was not a panicked woman seeking comfort from her family. This was a highly coordinated strategic ambush. They had sat around a table somewhere and planned this exact conversation. They had mapped out my psychological weaknesses. They used Charles to attack my faith and my sense of moral duty. They used Greg to attack my financial security and my business logic. They were operating like a sophisticated criminal syndicate, trying to extort an old man they viewed as an easy target. They thought I was just a tired, aging workhorse. They thought I was so terrified of being alone in my senior years that I would willingly accept a life of profound humiliation. They looked at me and saw nothing but a massive, endless bank account. They saw a safety net for Rebecca's mistakes and a permanent funding source for their entire greedy family. I looked at Rebecca. She was peeking at me through her fingers, wiping away fake tears, waiting to see if the psychological warfare had worked. I looked at Charles, who sat tall and proud, believing his holy sermon had broken my will. I looked at Greg, who was smirking slightly, fully convinced his corporate blackmail had cornered me into submission. In that moment, I realized I could not fight them with righteous anger. If I exploded and kicked them out of my house, they would immediately rush to high-priced divorce attorneys. They would empty our joint bank accounts. They would launch a massive smear campaign against me in the community before I even had a chance to defend myself. I was facing a pack of hungry wolves, and the only way to defeat them was to let them believe they had successfully backed me into a corner. I took a deep, shaky breath. I let my shoulders slump forward perfectly, mimicking the posture of a defeated, broken man. I looked down at my worn boots, avoiding their confident stares. I forced my voice to sound raspy and weak. I told them they were right. I let the words hang in the air, allowing them to savor their twisted victory. I told Charles that I could not bear the thought of a public scandal destroying the church community. I told Greg that he was absolutely right about the business, and that a highly publicized divorce would ruin everything I had worked for. I looked at Rebecca and told her with a perfectly fabricated tone of resignation that I was just so tired. I told her I did not want to lose my family. I agreed to accept the child. I agreed to swallow my pride and be the man they demanded me to be. The transformation in the room was instant and sickening. The heavy, tense atmosphere vanished completely. Charles let out a loud, booming sigh of relief and slapped his knee. He stood up, walked over to me, and clapped his heavy hand on my shoulder, congratulating me on making the righteous Christian choice. Greg leaned back in his chair, chuckling softly, shaking his head as if a minor inconvenience had simply been brushed aside. Rebecca jumped up and ran to me, throwing her arms around my neck, sobbing tears of genuine relief. She thanked me repeatedly, promising that I would never ever regret this decision. I patted her back mechanically, staring blankly at the wall over her shoulder. I played the role of the submissive, forgiving husband flawlessly. I walked them to the front door, watching as Charles and Greg shook my hand before walking out to their expensive vehicles. They drove away down the long gravel driveway, completely satisfied that they had secured their financial future, using my life as their personal foundation. I closed the heavy oak door and locked it. I stood alone in the quiet hallway. The performance was over. My face hardened into a mask of pure, relentless determination. They thought they had outsmarted a foolish old man. They thought I was going to quietly fund the lifestyle of the man who had violated my marriage. They had absolutely no idea what they had just unleashed. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire world. I was going to uncover the identity of the lover. I was going to trace every single penny they had ever touched, and I was going to use the full, devastating power of the law to crush them into absolute ruin. They demanded I be a man and step up. They were about to find out exactly what kind of man I truly was. The sun came up the next morning like a heavy, crushing weight pressing down on my chest. I woke up in the guest bedroom. My bones deeply ached from the cold Ohio weather and the sheer extreme exhaustion of the lies I was now forced to live with. I walked slowly down the stairs to the kitchen. Rebecca was already there preparing breakfast. She was humming a soft, familiar church hymn while she cooked. It made my stomach turn over in absolute disgust. Just yesterday, she was weeping uncontrollably on the hardwood floor, begging for mercy. Today, she was cracking eggs and pouring orange juice, as if she had not just confessed to bringing another man into our marriage bed. She looked up when I entered the room and smiled at me. It was a bright, relieved, victorious smile. She truly thought she had won. She thought her father and her brother had successfully broken my spirit and cornered me into submission. She poured a cup of black coffee and handed it to me. She kissed my rough cheek and told me how incredibly grateful she was that I was such a good, forgiving Christian man. She said we were going to be a beautiful, happy family, and that this baby would bring us closer together than ever before. I forced the corners of my mouth to lift. I nodded silently and drank the bitter hot coffee. Every single instinct in my body screamed at me to throw the ceramic mug against the expensive marble wall and demand the absolute truth. But I held my fire. I told her I had a long, difficult day ahead at the steel fabrication yard and needed to get to work early. I walked out the front door and got into my heavy work truck. The very moment the solid truck door slammed shut, I let the fake smile completely drop. My face turned to cold, hard stone. I drove straight past the turnoff for the steel yard and headed out to a small 24-hour diner located on the edge of the county line. I parked my truck in the extremely back corner of the lot, far away from the main windows where anyone might see me. Sitting in a faded vinyl booth by the emergency exit was Bill. Bill was a retired police detective turned private investigator. I had known him for over 20 years. He handled the deep background checks for my most sensitive corporate hires. He was a man who knew exactly how to find ghosts, and more importantly, he knew how to keep his mouth shut. I slid into the booth across from him. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or small talk. I looked him in the eye and told him I needed to immediately monitor my own house and my wife's personal vehicle. I told him I suspected severe financial and personal infidelity. Bill did not judge me. He did not ask prying personal questions. He simply nodded his head slowly and slid a heavy padded yellow envelope across the table. Inside the envelope were 3 small black devices. They were high-grade voice-activated audio recorders. He explained exactly how they worked in a low, quiet voice. He said they would record only when someone was actively speaking, making it easy to review the audio later. They had enough battery life to last for several weeks without needing to be recharged. He told me to place them in locations where she felt the absolute most comfortable and secure. I thanked him, paid him a large envelope of cash, and walked out of the diner. I held that padded envelope tightly in my hands. It felt exactly like holding a live explosive. I went back to my house mid-morning. I knew Rebecca had her weekly ladies' charity brunch at the local country club and would be gone until the early afternoon. The house was completely silent and empty. I walked straight into the large attached garage. Her pristine white luxury sport utility vehicle was parked inside. I had bought her that vehicle outright in cash for her birthday just 2 years ago as a symbol of my hard work and devotion. I opened the passenger door and crawled awkwardly under the premium leather seat. My bad knees popped and flared with sharp pain, but I ignored it completely. I attached the first small magnetic recorder deep under the metal seat frame, where no mechanic or detailer would ever look. Then, I went inside the house. I walked into the massive living room where her father, Charles, had arrogantly commanded me to swallow my pride the day before. I placed the second recorder deeply hidden underneath the heavy mahogany side table near the plush sofa where Rebecca usually sat to make her private phone calls. I took the third and final recorder and walked into the kitchen. I taped it securely underneath the thick marble island. That was her daily command center. That was where she plotted and planned her social calendar. I stood in the exact middle of my own home, feeling a profound, deep sense of violation. I was actively planting listening devices in the house I had built with my own hands, just to uncover the malicious lies of the woman I loved. It was a humiliating and degrading task. But a man does not survive 40 years in the brutal steel industry by closing his eyes to a massive leak in the roof. You find the leak, and you tear it out completely. For the next 48 hours, I lived in a state of absolute psychological torture. I went to work at the steel yard every single day. I wore my scratched hard hat and my thick, heavy leather gloves. I walked the noisy production floor, checking the welding seams and inspecting the massive structural trusses. I saw her younger brother Greg walking around the procurement office in his clean, pressed polo shirt. Greg would look at me and smirk slightly, thinking he had completely outsmarted his wealthy older brother-in-law. He truly thought I was just a tired old man who was too scared of being alone to fight back against his family. I greeted him politely. I asked him normal mundane questions about the supply chain schedules and the raw material shipments. I played the role of the defeated compliant boss perfectly. I went home every night and ate dinner with Rebecca. I listened to her talk excitedly about baby clothes and neutral nursery colors. I watched her rub her flat stomach and smile softly at me. I nodded and agreed with every ridiculous lie she spun. I was a silent ghost watching my own life happen from the outside. The physical toll on my body was massive. My blood pressure spiked dangerously, and my chest felt tight with constant overwhelming anxiety. But I knew cold, relentless patience was my only weapon. On the third night, I finally got my chance to uncover the truth. Rebecca went to bed early, complaining of severe morning sickness. I waited in the living room until I heard her breathing grow deep and steady through the baby monitor she used to listen for the dog. I quietly walked down to the kitchen and retrieved the recorder from underneath the marble island. Then I went out to the dark garage and retrieved the device from her vehicle. I took my personal laptop out to my truck, locked the heavy doors, and plugged the devices in. My hands were sweating profusely. I opened the first audio file from her vehicle. It was recorded earlier that same afternoon. For the first few seconds, there was only the low hum of the engine and the radio playing soft, classical music. Then the music was turned down quickly, and the sound of dialing filled the cabin. The phone rang twice over the Bluetooth speaker system before a man answered. When I heard the man speak, the breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. I knew that voice intimately. I knew that confident, slick, arrogant tone. I heard that exact voice every single Monday morning during my corporate executive financial briefings. It was Derek. Derek was my corporate financial controller. He was 35 years old, sharply dressed, and highly educated. I had hired him 3 years ago to manage the multi-million-dollar operating accounts of my steel fabrication company. He handled my entire payroll, my complex corporate taxes, and my highly sensitive private investment portfolios. He was the man I trusted implicitly to protect my life savings, and he was the man sleeping with my wife. The massive betrayal hit me with the destructive force of a swinging steel beam. It was not just some random younger man from the gym or the local country club. It was my own trusted employee. The dark layers of this deception were so incredibly deep and vile that I actually felt physically dizzy sitting in my truck. Derek was not just a secret lover. He was the absolute guardian of my entire financial empire. If he was arrogant enough to be sleeping with his boss's wife, what else was he doing behind my back? The financial implications were utterly catastrophic. I gripped the steering wheel of my truck, trying desperately to steady my racing heart. I clicked the mouse and pressed play again, forcing myself to listen to the rest of the horrible conversation. Derek asked her how things were going at the house. Rebecca laughed loudly. It was not her sweet, gentle, church-going laugh. It was a cruel, mocking, sinister sound. She told Derek that the old man bought the whole story without a single pressing question. She said I was so desperately terrified of avoiding a public scandal that I just rolled over and accepted another man's child as my own. She actually called me a pathetic, tired old workhorse. Derek chuckled warmly on the other end of the line. He told her she was a brilliant, flawless actress. He praised her father, Charles, and her brother, Greg, for playing their parts so perfectly. He said Greg really nailed the corporate blackmail speech and had me completely terrified of losing my company. My blood ran ice cold in my veins. They were all in on it together. Derek, Rebecca, Charles, and Greg. It was a massive, highly coordinated conspiracy designed to trap me. I kept listening in the dark as their conversation shifted from mocking my age to planning their future wealth. Derek told Rebecca they just needed to hold on and play the game for a little while longer. He said once the baby was officially born, my name would be permanently on the birth certificate, securing a lifelong, unbreakable financial anchor to my estate. Rebecca excitedly talked about how my company valuation was going up every single quarter. She told Derek that if anything ever happened to my health, or if they pushed me into an early grave from the sheer stress of the situation, she would inherit absolutely everything. Derek told her not to worry about the money. He said he was already making sure the company accounts were positioned perfectly for when she eventually took over as the grieving widow. He said they would use my hard-earned money to buy a massive luxury beachfront estate in Florida and leave the miserable, freezing Ohio winters behind forever. They talked about my money and my assets as if I were already dead and buried in the ground. They spent my life savings in their greedy imaginations, laughing and flirting while I was breaking my back at the steel yard every single day to provide for them. I sat in the dark, silent cabin of my truck, listening to my wife and my trusted employee plan my total, absolute destruction. The sheer monumental arrogance of their conversation was breathtaking. They truly thought they had accounted for every single variable in my life. They thought they had completely trapped me in a tight web of religious guilt and corporate fear. They thought I was too old, too tired, and too stupid to see the knife they were slowly driving into my back. But they had made one massive, fatal mistake. They had entirely underestimated the cold, relentless, calculating patience of a man who built his life from scratch. I did not inherit my money. I earned it in the extreme, brutal heat of the fabrication shop. I knew how to forge raw, ugly iron into unbreakable steel. I pulled the small audio recorder from the laptop port and placed it safely deep inside my jacket pocket. I did not feel heartbroken anymore. The profound sadness was completely gone. All that remained inside my soul was a pure, refined, absolute determination to burn their entire world to ash. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I needed to know exactly what Derek was doing with my company accounts. I needed to meticulously trace every single dollar that moved through my business. If he was arrogant enough to sleep with the boss's wife in my own bed, he was definitely arrogant enough to steal from the boss's bank accounts. I looked out the windshield of my truck at the large, dark, beautiful house I had bought for Rebecca. She was sleeping soundly inside, dreaming of Florida beaches and stolen wealth. I decided to let her dream. Because when she finally woke up to the harsh, brutal reality of what I was about to do, she would have absolutely nothing left. Not her younger lover, not her manipulative family, and not a single dime of my money. The silent war had officially begun, and I held the ultimate weapon in my hand. The drive to the fabrication yard the following morning felt like a long, slow march to the executioner's block. The Ohio sky was a heavy, suffocating blanket of bruised iron gray, and the cold morning rain battered the windshield of my heavy work truck. Every single muscle in my 64-year-old body ached with a deep, bone-chilling fatigue. I had not slept a single minute the night before. My mind had been spinning relentlessly, playing the audio recordings of my wife and my trusted employee mocking me in the dark. I held the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. I had to force myself to breathe slowly and evenly. I knew the moment I walked through the glass doors of my corporate office, I would have to perform the absolute greatest acting job of my entire life. I parked my truck in my reserved spot and walked toward the main building. The familiar sharp metallic smell of grinding steel and hot welding flux filled the damp air. This company was my life. I had built it from a single rusted pickup truck into a multi-million-dollar empire. Every steel truss, every commercial roofing contract, and every piece of heavy machinery was paid for by the sweat of my brow and the calluses on my hands. Now I was walking into my own building, knowing a parasite was sitting comfortably inside, feeding off my life's work. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped into the warm, carpeted reception area. Almost immediately, I saw him. Derek. He was standing by the reception desk, sipping coffee from a ceramic mug and laughing easily with one of the administrative assistants. Derek was 35 years old. He wore a crisp, custom-tailored navy blue suit and an expensive silk tie. His dark hair was slicked back perfectly, and his face held that permanent, arrogant smirk of a man who believed he was always the smartest person in the room. He was my financial comptroller. He was the man I paid a very handsome six-figure salary to protect my business. He was the man sleeping with my wife. Derek turned and saw me. The arrogant smirk immediately vanished, replaced by a look of deep, fabricated sympathy. He walked over to me and placed a gentle, reassuring hand on my shoulder. He lowered his voice, looking at me with fake concern. He asked me how I was doing today. He said Rebecca had texted him this morning saying I was under a lot of personal stress and that I might be coming in late. The sheer, unadulterated evil of his behavior made my stomach churn. He was sleeping with my wife, plotting to steal my wealth, and pretending to be my concerned, loyal friend all at the exact same time. I forced myself to look him directly in the eye. I did not flinch. I did not let a single ounce of my burning rage show on my face. I gave him a tired, defeated smile. I told him it was just a tough morning and that getting older was finally catching up to me. I thanked him for his concern and told him I just needed to bury myself in paperwork to clear my head. Derek patted my shoulder again, telling me to take it easy and that he had everything handled on the financial end. He confidently promised that I did not need to worry about a single thing regarding the company accounts. I thanked him again and walked into my private office, locking the heavy wooden door behind me. I sat down at my large oak desk and opened my secure personal laptop. I did not waste a single second. I pulled up a secure encrypted browser and found the contact information for an elite forensic accounting firm located 3 hours away in Columbus. I could not use any local accountants. I needed absolute secrecy, and I needed ruthless efficiency. I dialed their emergency corporate number using a prepaid burner phone I kept in my desk drawer for private vendor negotiations. I spoke directly to one of their senior partners. I told him I needed a full comprehensive forensic audit of my entire operating budget stretching back exactly 36 months. I made it explicitly clear that this had to be conducted immediately and quietly. We established a solid cover story. The forensic accountants would arrive the very next morning under the guise of an annual IRS compliance check. It was the perfect excuse. A random deep dive audit for tax preparation is a standard corporate procedure, and it would not immediately raise any red flags for a competent financial comptroller. After hanging up with the auditing firm, I called my lead information technology director into my office. I told him about the upcoming IRS compliance check. I instructed him to quietly restrict Derek's master administrative permissions on the back-end servers. I told the IT director it was a strict requirement from the auditors to preserve the integrity of the historical data during their review. Derek would still have access to his daily operational files, but he would be completely locked out of deleting, altering, or hiding any past financial records. The trap was set, and Derek had absolutely no idea the jaws were already closing around him. The next morning, a team of 3 sharp-looking men in dark suits arrived at the fabrication yard. I met them in the lobby and introduced them to my staff as an outside firm hired to optimize our tax compliance. I walked them into the main financial hub and introduced them directly to Derek. I watched Derek's face very closely. For a fraction of a second, his eyes darted toward the thick, heavy briefcases the auditors carried. I saw the tiny, microscopic flash of panic cross his arrogant face, but he recovered incredibly fast. Derek smiled broadly, shook their hands, and offered them full access to the filing room. He played the part of the transparent, cooperative employee. He even joked that he hoped they did not find any misplaced decimal points in his spreadsheets. The lead auditor, a serious, unsmiling man named Mr. Miller, simply nodded and asked to be shown to the secondary conference room. For the next 3 days, the tension in my life was a suffocating physical weight. I had to continue operating as the defeated, compliant husband at home and the oblivious, trusting boss at work. Every single night, I sat at the dinner table with Rebecca. I listened to her talk endlessly about scheduling doctor appointments and looking at cribs online. She constantly praised me for being such a strong, supportive Christian man. She held my hand across the table, her eyes shining with fake gratitude, while the audio recorders hidden in her car and under my kitchen island captured her daily phone calls with Derek. They were still laughing at me. They were still planning their future on a sunny Florida beach. My blood pressure soared so high my ears constantly rang, but I maintained my absolute discipline. At the office, Derek tried to act as though everything was perfectly normal. He walked around the floor with his coffee mug, joking with the staff. But I noticed the small, subtle changes in his behavior. He paced the hallways near the secondary conference room where the auditors were working. He constantly checked his phone. He tried twice to access the historical server data, and when he found his permissions restricted, he came into my office with a forced, casual smile, asking if there was a glitch in the network. I simply waved my hand and told him the IT department was running a security update for the auditors, and not to worry about it. He smiled and walked out, but I could see the sweat forming on the back of his neck. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the waiting finally came to an end. My office phone rang, and Mr. Miller, the lead forensic auditor, asked if I had a moment to step into the conference room. I walked down the hall, my boots heavy on the linoleum floor. I entered the conference room, and Mr. Miller immediately stood up and closed the blinds on the glass walls. The other 2 auditors were sitting silently at the long table surrounded by massive stacks of printed ledgers, highlighted bank statements, and heavily annotated digital spreadsheets. Mr. Miller did not smile. He looked at me with a grim, professional expression. He pushed a thick, heavy binder across the polished table toward me. He told me to take a seat. He explained that my business was highly profitable and structurally sound. But then he opened the binder to a section flagged with bright red sticky notes. He told me that when they started cross-referencing the accounts payable against the actual physical inventory delivered to the steel yard, they found a massive, undeniable discrepancy. Mr. Miller pointed a pen at a long column of numbers. He explained the mechanism of the leak. It was a sophisticated, deliberate funnel. Over the past 36 months, someone had been creating dummy vendor invoices. They had registered fake LLC companies in the neighboring state. These fake companies were billing my business for raw steel, copper wiring, and commercial roofing materials that were absolutely never delivered to my yard. The invoices were perfectly formatted, perfectly timed to blend in with our busy season purchases, and perfectly authorized. I stared at the numbers printed on the crisp white paper. The cold, hard truth of the mathematics was devastating. I asked Mr. Miller for the exact total. He looked me dead in the eye and told me the number, $420,000. Over the last 3 years, $420,000 of my hard-earned money had been systematically bled out of my company and funneled into untraceable offshore holding accounts. My mouth went completely dry. I asked the final most important question, even though I already knew the horrible answer. I asked him who authorized those specific payments. Mr. Miller turned the page, revealing copies of the digital authorization signatures. Because the amounts were kept just under the threshold that required my personal secondary approval, they bypassed the usual checks. Every single dummy invoice, every single fraudulent wire transfer, and every single stolen dollar had been personally authorized, approved, and executed by one man. My financial controller, Derek. I sat back in the heavy leather conference chair. The silence in the room was absolute. I stared at Derek's digital signature repeated over and over again on the fraudulent invoices. $420,000. It was not just a simple mistake or a brief lapse in judgment. It was a massive, calculated federal crime. Wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and grand larceny. If Derek was caught, he would not just be fired. He would face decades in a federal penitentiary. And then, as I sat in that quiet room surrounded by the undeniable proof of his crimes, the ultimate horrifying realization hit me like a runaway freight train. I thought about Rebecca. I thought about the positive pregnancy test. I thought about the tears and the desperate performance in my kitchen. Rebecca and Derek were not just a couple of foolish lovers who got careless and accidentally got pregnant. This was not a tragic romance. This was a calculated corporate heist, and the baby was their ultimate insurance policy. They had been stealing from me for 3 years. $420,000 was a massive amount of money to hide. They knew that eventually my business would expand, or the IRS would come knocking, and the missing funds would be discovered. Derek was getting nervous. The walls were starting to close in on their embezzlement scheme. They needed a permanent, unbreakable shield to protect themselves from my wrath when the money was finally noticed. They needed me entirely paralyzed. They needed me financially and legally bound to Rebecca in a way that I could not easily escape. If Rebecca had a baby, and I legally claimed it as my own, I would be permanently tied to her for the rest of my life. They figured that if I ever discovered the missing money later down the road, the absolute public humiliation of a divorce involving a new infant child would force me to stay quiet. They believed my pride and my devotion to my community image would prevent me from calling the police and sending the mother of my supposed child to prison. They wanted to use the pure, innocent life of an unborn baby as a human shield for a federal felony. The sheer profound evil of their plot was staggering. It was so incredibly dark and vicious that it completely eradicated any lingering shred of sadness or pity I had left in my soul. They were not just stealing my money. They were trying to steal the rest of my entire life. They wanted me to work until I died, so they could take everything I had built. I closed the thick black binder and rested my hands flat on the cover. My resolve was no longer just a desire for justice. It was forged into something much harder. Unbreakable, unyielding steel. I looked up at Mr. Miller and his team of auditors. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I thanked them for their exceptional work. I instructed them to continue digging into the offshore accounts to find exactly where every single dime was hiding. I told them to prepare the final verified report with perfect, unassailable documentation, because we were not just going to fire an employee. We were going to hand a perfect, irrefutable criminal case directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I stood up from the conference table feeling completely transformed. The tired, broken old man who had walked into his kitchen a few nights ago was entirely dead. I walked out of the conference room and looked down the hallway toward Derek's office. I knew the truth now. I knew the full, terrifying extent of the betrayal. And I was going to make absolutely certain that the trap they had so carefully set for me would be the exact mechanism of their total and complete destruction. I spent the next 48 hours moving through my life like a ghost, haunting my own home. Every morning I put on my heavy steel-toed boots and drove to the fabrication yard. Every afternoon, I reviewed the production schedules and signed the daily operational logs. Every evening, I sat across the dining room table from the woman who had brought another man into our marriage. I watched Rebecca smile and talk about her prenatal vitamins. I listened to her complain about her minor aches and pains. I nodded politely and offered her glasses of cold water, playing the role of the attentive older husband who had accepted his new reality. My patience was completely absolute, but the physical toll it took on my body was agonizing. My chest felt like it was wrapped in heavy iron chains. I was waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place. On Thursday afternoon, my office phone rang. It was Mr. Miller, the lead forensic accountant. He did not ask how my day was going. His voice was completely flat and strictly professional. He told me he needed me to step into the secondary conference room immediately. He said they had finished tracing the routing numbers from the dummy vendor invoices, and he had found something that required my direct attention. I hung up the phone and stood up from my desk. My joints popped and ached as I walked down the long, carpeted hallway. I passed by the procurement department. I saw my brother-in-law, Greg, sitting at his desk. Greg was laughing loudly at something on his computer screen, his feet propped up on the bottom drawer of his desk. He was wearing a company jacket that I had paid for. I looked at him for a brief second, feeling a strange knot of anticipation in my gut. I turned away and walked into the conference room. Mr. Miller locked the door behind me. The blinds were already pulled tightly shut. The long mahogany table was no longer covered in chaotic stacks of paper. Instead, there was only one single, sleek black folder resting in the exact center of the table. The other two auditors were packing up their briefcases. Their job was done. Mr. Miller gestured for me to sit down in the heavy leather chair across from him. I sat down and folded my calloused hands in my lap. I asked him where the stolen $420,000 had gone. Mr. Miller opened the black folder. He told me that tracing the money had been difficult because Derek had used highly sophisticated methods to mask the wire transfers. Derek had set up 3 separate shell companies in neighboring states, all registered under generic names that sounded like legitimate steel and copper suppliers. But Mr. Miller and his team had relentlessly followed the digital paper trail. They tracked the money from my corporate operating accounts into the shell company accounts, and then they tracked it again as it was quickly wired out of the country. Mr. Miller slid a printed bank statement across the table. He told me the money did not stay with Derek. Derek was the architect of the theft, but he was not the ultimate beneficiary. The funds were being rapidly funneled into a series of offshore accounts located in the Caribbean. Mr. Miller explained that these specific offshore accounts were notorious for being associated with massive unregulated online gambling syndicates and underground sports betting rings. I stared at the bank statement completely confused. Derek was an arrogant man who liked expensive suits and luxury cars, but he was not a gambler. He was a meticulous, calculating numbers guy. I asked Mr. Miller why my financial comptroller was wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars to illegal offshore sports books. Mr. Miller did not answer right away. He turned to the next page in the folder. He produced a copy of an extremely complicated corporate registry document. He told me that in order to open the offshore accounts, the recipient had to provide a verified passport and a secondary proof of identification. The offshore banks required a real human being to be listed as the primary account holder. Mr. Miller tapped his pen against a specific line of text on the document. He told me to read the name of the man who owned the gambling accounts. I leaned forward and looked at the highlighted text. The name printed on the offshore registry was Gregory. It was my wife's younger brother. It was the man sitting at a desk not 50 feet away from where I was currently sitting. The air vanished from the room. I could hear the heavy thud of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. I looked up at Mr. Miller and asked him to explain exactly what this meant. Mr. Miller spoke in a calm, steady voice. He told me that Greg had a massive, catastrophic gambling addiction. Based on the frequency and the enormous size of the wire transfers, Greg was deeply in debt to some very dangerous people. He was losing tens of thousands of dollars every single month on offshore sports betting. Mr. Miller explained the mechanics of the conspiracy. Greg was drowning in illegal debt and had absolutely no way to pay it off on his modest procurement salary. So he went to Derek. Derek controlled the corporate purse strings. Derek had the administrative power to create the fake invoices and approve the fraudulent payments. Derek systematically stole my money and used it to pay off Greg's massive gambling debts, keeping Greg out of severe physical and legal danger. I sat there perfectly still, letting the horrifying reality of the situation wash over me. I asked myself why Derek would ever risk decades in a federal prison just to pay off the gambling debts of his boss's brother-in-law. Derek was a selfish, greedy man. He would never do something that dangerous out of the kindness of his heart. There had to be a transaction. There had to be a trade. And then the entire sickening picture snapped into perfect, brutal focus. Derek paid off Greg's massive gambling debts using my money. In exchange, Greg provided Derek with the ultimate cover story. I thought back over the last 3 years. I remembered all the times Rebecca told me she was going out of town for a long weekend to attend a church retreat or a charity gala. She always told me that her brother Greg was going with her to help drive and keep her company. I remembered the times I had to travel for out-of-state roofing conventions, and Greg would offer to stay at my house to make sure Rebecca felt safe. Greg was their alibi. The brother-in-law was the lookout. Every time Rebecca and Derek wanted to spend a weekend together in a luxury hotel, Greg would tell me he was with his sister. He provided the perfect, unbreakable family excuse. He actively facilitated the absolute destruction of my marriage. He helped another man sleep with his own sister, all while using my stolen money to fund his pathetic illegal gambling addiction. The depravity of it was absolutely paralyzing. This was not a simple affair. This was a transactional, highly coordinated criminal enterprise operating right inside my own family. Derek got unlimited access to my wife. Greg got a continuous stream of stolen cash to pay off his bookies. And Rebecca got the thrilling, dangerous romance she craved, all while maintaining her luxurious lifestyle on my dime. They were all using me. They viewed me as a blind, stupid bank vault. I closed my eyes as a sudden wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. If Greg knew about the affair and the embezzlement, then the timeline of the ambush at my house took on a completely new and terrifying meaning. I thought back to this morning after Rebecca confessed her pregnancy. I remembered her father, Charles, marching into my living room in his tailored suit. I remembered Charles sitting on my leather sofa, using my Christian faith as a weapon against me. He had commanded me to swallow my pride. He had ordered me to be a man and step up for the baby to protect the family reputation. Charles was a prominent, respected man in our local community. He was obsessed with his public image. For days I had believed Charles was simply trying to protect his daughter from the shame of a public divorce. But looking at the offshore gambling records sitting on the conference table, I realized how incredibly naive I had been. Charles did not come to my house to protect Rebecca. Charles came to my house to protect Greg. Charles had to know about the gambling debts. A father always knows when his son is in that kind of deep, desperate trouble. Charles likely knew that Derek was funneling my money to save Greg from being destroyed by loan sharks or federal investigators. If I divorced Rebecca and kicked her out of the house, the entire house of cards would instantly collapse. If I hired divorce attorneys, they would dig into my finances, and they would inevitably find the stolen $420,000. If the embezzlement was discovered, Derek would go to prison for wire fraud, and Greg would go to prison right alongside him as a co-conspirator. Charles had orchestrated that entire morning ambush to save his son from a federal indictment. The grand speech about Christian forgiveness and stepping up to raise the child was a complete and utter sham. Charles was acting like a mafia boss, protecting his criminal syndicate. He needed me to stay in the marriage. He needed me to accept the baby quietly. He needed me to remain completely ignorant so his precious son could stay out of a prison cell and keep using my company as a personal piggy bank. The entire family was complicit in robbing me blind. They were all smiling at my dinner table, attending my church, and shaking my hand while actively participating in my total financial and emotional ruin. They thought they had trapped me. They thought their coordinated psychological attack had broken my spirit. They truly believed I was going to raise Derek's child and continue paying for Greg's gambling addiction until the day I dropped dead from sheer exhaustion. I opened my eyes and looked across the table at Mr. Miller. He was watching me carefully, waiting for my reaction. I did not yell. I did not pound my fists on the mahogany table. I felt a cold, absolute stillness settle deep inside my bones. The fiery rage had completely burned away, leaving nothing but pure, calculated ice. I asked Mr. Miller to package every single piece of evidence into a secure physical binder. I wanted the fake vendor invoices, the digital authorization signatures, and the offshore registry documents linking everything directly to Greg and Derek. I told him I needed it all formatted perfectly so that a federal prosecutor could read it like a simple children's book. Mr. Miller nodded firmly. He told me his team would finalize the report by the end of the week. He promised me the documentation would be absolutely ironclad. I stood up from the conference table and shook Mr. Miller's hand. I thanked him for his incredible discretion and his tireless work. I walked out of the conference room and stepped back into the busy, noisy hallway of my company. The sound of the fabrication machines echoed through the walls. The smell of hot steel filled the air. This was my domain. This was the empire I built with calloused hands and aching muscles. I looked down the hall and saw Greg still sitting at his desk. He was sipping a soda and scrolling lazily through his phone, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire life was about to be obliterated. I walked right past him, heading toward my private office. I gave him a polite nod as I passed by. Greg smiled his arrogant little smirk and asked me how the tax audit was going. I stopped and looked at him. I gave him a warm, reassuring smile. I told him the audit was going perfectly and that the accountants had found everything they needed. Greg chuckled and told me he was glad to hear it. I walked into my office and locked the door. I walked over to the large window overlooking the massive steel yard. I watched my heavy machinery lifting massive steel beams into the gray Ohio sky. The family thought they had completely won. They thought the older husband was securely locked in his cage. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot that the man they were trying to steal from was a man who spent his entire life forging steel. They thought they could break me with their lies. Instead, they had just handed me the exact tools I needed to dismantle their entire existence. The investigation was complete. Now it was time to speak with my attorney. It was time to prepare the execution. The rain had finally stopped, but the heavy gray Ohio clouds still hung low and thick over the city. I sat alone in the quiet cab of my work truck, gripping the steering wheel. I had just finished loading the forensic accounting reports into a secure briefcase. The absolute truth about my brother-in-law and my financial comptroller was sitting right next to me on the passenger seat. They had stolen $420,000 from my business to cover illegal gambling debts. But before I could drive downtown to meet with my legal counsel, I had one final task to complete. I needed to pull the last audio file from the small black recorder I had planted underneath my kitchen island. I plugged the device into my laptop and stared at the digital screen. The file was recorded late last night while I was pretending to be asleep in the guest bedroom. I clicked play and leaned my head back against the heavy headrest of my truck. The sound of my own kitchen filled the speakers. I heard the familiar clinking of expensive crystal wine glasses. I heard the soft hum of the refrigerator. And then I heard their voices. Derek and Rebecca were sitting at the marble island I had paid for drinking the wine I had bought, laughing in the dark. Derek sounded nervous. His voice was completely different from the confident, arrogant tone he used while walking around my fabrication yard. He was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. He told Rebecca that he was worried about the long-term plan. He asked her what would happen if I somehow woke up from my compliant trance and decided to fight back. He brought up the prenuptial agreement we had signed 12 years ago. He told her that he had seen my corporate attorneys in action, and he knew they drafted ruthless, ironclad contracts. Derek sounded genuinely terrified. He asked her what would happen if a judge upheld the prenup and threw her out on the street with absolutely nothing. Then Rebecca laughed. It was a cold, sharp, mocking sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had lived with this woman for 12 years, and I had never heard her make a sound so utterly devoid of human empathy. She told Derek to calm down and stop acting like a frightened child. She spoke slowly and deliberately, dripping with supreme arrogance. She told him that a piece of paper from 12 years ago meant absolutely nothing now. She said I was a dinosaur who did not understand how the modern legal system actually worked. Then she laid out her ultimate legal strategy, and it chilled my blood to the absolute core. Rebecca confidently explained the child welfare loophole. She told Derek that family court judges in the state of Ohio do not care about old corporate contracts when a helpless infant is involved. She said that because I had already agreed to stay in the marriage and sign the birth certificate, I would be legally established as the father of her baby. She explained that no judge in the country would ever enforce a strict prenuptial agreement that left a pregnant mother and a newborn child out in the cold. The court would automatically invalidate the prenup to ensure the financial welfare of the child. She said it was a foolproof, bulletproof legal strategy. She was going to use the life of an unborn baby as a legal wrecking ball to shatter my life's work. I listened to her voice grow increasingly excited as she calculated the impending payday. She told Derek that she had quietly looked at the recent insurance valuations for my commercial roofing and steel fabrication business. She knew the company was currently valued at a staggering $15 million. She said the moment the baby was born, she would secure her untouchable position. After a few months of pretending to play the happy family, she would file for a sudden, highly public divorce, citing my older age and my demanding work schedule as the reasons for the marital breakdown. She calculated out loud. She told Derek she would walk away with half of the $15 million business, the sprawling suburban house, and at least $20,000 a month in permanent alimony and child support. She actually sighed with deep satisfaction on the recording. She told her lover that all they had to do was wait just a little bit longer. She said I was working myself into an early grave just to hand my entire empire directly over to them. She called me a blind, pathetic old fool who cared more about my community reputation than my own dignity. I reached out and stopped the recording. The silence inside my truck was deafening. I sat perfectly still, staring out at the wet pavement of the parking lot. The sheer, profound malice of her logic was staggering. She was not just trying to survive an accidental pregnancy. She was actively weaponizing the family court system. She was fully prepared to drag my name through the mud, destroy my mental health, and legally steal $7.5 million of my hard-earned money simply because she believed the law would blindly favor a weeping mother over an aging blue-collar worker. I put the laptop away and started the truck engine. I did not feel any lingering sadness. I did not feel any residual heartbreak. I felt a pure, dangerous clarity. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove directly into the heart of downtown Columbus. I parked my truck in the underground garage of a sleek, towering glass building. I took the private elevator up to the 40th floor. This was the headquarters of the most ruthless corporate law firm in the state. I walked past the expensive modern artwork and the quiet receptionists stepping directly into the corner office of my lead attorney, Robert. Robert had been my personal and corporate lawyer for over 20 years. He was a sharp, fiercely intelligent man in his late 60s who viewed legal contracts the way I viewed steel beams. He knew exactly where to apply pressure to make an entire structure collapse. Robert stood up from behind his massive oak desk when I walked in. He took one look at my face and immediately locked his office door. I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from him and placed the forensic audit binder on his desk. I did not mince words. I spent the next hour laying out the entire horrific conspiracy. I explained my wife's pregnancy by another man. I explained the ambush by my father-in-law Charles and my brother-in-law Greg. I showed him the audit proving Derek and Greg had embezzled $420,000 through dummy vendor accounts to pay off offshore gambling debts. And finally, I placed the small audio recorder on his desk and played the conversation where Rebecca detailed her plan to use the child welfare loophole to break my prenuptial agreement and steal half of my $15 million company. Robert listened to the entire recording in absolute dead silence. He did not interrupt. He did not show any outward emotion. When the audio finally stopped playing, he leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands across his chest. He looked at the forensic audit binder, and then he looked at me. He told me that Rebecca was incredibly dangerous because she was partially right. Robert explained the enemy's logic in cold, clinical terms. He said that in a standard traditional divorce involving infidelity, a clever lawyer could absolutely argue that a prenuptial agreement should be thrown out to protect the welfare of a newborn child. He said judges historically lean toward protecting the mother and the infant, especially when the husband is a high-net-worth individual. If this was just a simple case of a cheating wife having a baby, Rebecca's vicious strategy might have actually worked. She might have successfully tied me up in court for years, bleeding my accounts dry and walking away with a massive settlement. My chest tightened. For a brief, agonizing second, I wondered if I had worked 40 years just to be legally robbed by a pack of arrogant thieves. I asked Robert if she was going to get away with it. I asked him if the law was truly going to allow a woman to steal half of my company just because she got pregnant by the man who was currently embezzling from my corporate accounts. Robert did not sigh. He did not look defeated. Instead, a slow, dark, predatory smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man who had already won the war before the first shot was ever fired. He reached down and unlocked the heavy bottom drawer of his desk. He pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. It was my original prenuptial agreement, the document we had drafted 12 years ago when Rebecca and I first got engaged. Robert opened the file and began to flip through the dense legal pages. He looked up at me and said that Rebecca had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. She assumed our prenuptial agreement was just a standard generic template printed off the internet. She completely forgot who she was dealing with. Robert reminded me of a long conversation we had in his office 12 years ago. At the time, my company was expanding rapidly, and I was deeply concerned about corporate espionage and internal theft. I had asked Robert to draft the most aggressive protective contract legally possible. Robert slid the document across the desk and pointed a silver pen at a specific, heavily highlighted paragraph buried deep in the 7th section of the contract. He told me to read the clause. It was titled the Absolute Fraud and Moral Turpitude Clause. Robert leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, intense pitch. He explained exactly what that clause meant in the eyes of the law. He said that a judge might invalidate a standard prenup for a simple physical affair or for the financial welfare of a child. But a judge will absolutely never invalidate a prenup if the spouse is actively engaged in a federal felony against the estate they are trying to claim. Robert tapped the forensic audit binder sitting on his desk. He told me that Rebecca did not just have a simple affair. She actively and knowingly conspired to commit massive corporate fraud. By providing an alibi for Derek and Greg, by covering up their whereabouts during company trips, and by discussing their stolen wealth on the audio recordings, Rebecca officially became a willing accomplice to federal wire fraud and grand larceny. She crossed the line from a cheating wife into a criminal co-conspirator. Robert smiled grimly, showing his teeth. He explained the absolute beauty of the ironclad trap. Because we had hard, undeniable proof that Rebecca was an active participant in a conspiracy to embezzle $420,000 from my business, the absolute fraud and moral turpitude clause was instantly and permanently triggered. The clause explicitly stated that any spouse found participating in financial fraud, corporate sabotage, or theft against the primary estate immediately forfeits all rights to any and all marital assets. Robert looked me directly in the eyes. He told me that she had completely destroyed her own child welfare loophole. A family court judge cannot award alimony or corporate equity to a spouse who is actively under federal investigation for stealing from the very company they are trying to divide. The moment we presented this evidence, her entire legal argument would evaporate into thin air. She would not get half of my $15 million business. She would not get the sprawling suburban house. She would not get $20,000 a month in permanent alimony. She would get absolutely nothing. $0, 0 cents. The profound, overwhelming relief that washed over my body was indescribable. I felt the heavy, crushing chains of anxiety instantly shatter and fall away from my chest. I had spent 40 years building my life with honesty and grueling labor. The thought of handing it over to a group of arrogant thieves had been slowly killing me. But sitting in that quiet, high-rise office looking at the legal mechanism of their total destruction, I felt my strength completely return. I was not a victim. I was the master of my own fate. I asked Robert what our next move was. I wanted to know exactly how we were going to drop this massive bomb on their heads. I did not just want to hand them papers in a quiet office. They had ambushed me in my own living room. They had mocked me in my own kitchen. They had insulted my intelligence and tried to use my Christian faith as a weapon against my sanity. I wanted their downfall to be spectacular. I wanted them to feel the exact same terror and helplessness they had tried to force upon me. Robert closed the thick prenuptial agreement and rested his hands on top of it. He told me that because the embezzlement involved dummy corporations crossing state lines and offshore gambling accounts, it fell completely out of local jurisdiction. This was a massive federal crime. He said he was going to make a private phone call to a contact he had at the local Federal Bureau of Investigation field office. He was going to hand-deliver the forensic audit and the audio recordings directly to a federal prosecutor. Robert told me the federal authorities would need about a week to verify the offshore routing numbers and secure the official arrest warrants for Derek and Greg. He instructed me to go back home and continue playing the role of the tired, defeated husband. He told me to keep smiling at Rebecca. He told me to keep acting completely oblivious at work. He needed me to keep them comfortable and confident, so they would not panic and try to flee the state before the federal agents were ready to strike. I stood up from the leather chair feeling taller and stronger than I had in months. I reached across the heavy oak desk and shook Robert's hand with a firm, crushing grip. The trap was perfectly laid. The legal and financial mechanisms were locked tightly into place. My wife, my father-in-law, my brother-in-law, and my arrogant financial controller had spent the last 3 years digging a massive grave for my business. But they had been completely blind to the fact that I was standing right behind them, ready to push them all inside. I walked out of the law firm and took the elevator down to the underground parking garage. I got back into my truck and started the engine. The cold rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets clean and bright under the emerging afternoon sun. I drove back toward the suburbs, toward the sprawling, beautiful house where my treacherous wife was eagerly waiting for me. I was going to smile at her tonight. I was going to play the fool for one final week. But deep down inside my soul, the old steel worker was preparing for the greatest demolition project of his entire life. I turned 65 years old the following weekend. To the outside world, 65 is a milestone worthy of grand celebration. It is a time to look back on a lifetime of hard work and look forward to the golden years of comfortable retirement. But for me, the celebration was nothing more than a carefully constructed stage. It was the theater where I would perform the greatest, most agonizing illusion of my entire life. I rented out the grand ballroom at the most exclusive country club in the county. I spared absolutely no expense. I paid for the premium catering, the top-shelf open bar, and the elaborate, towering floral arrangements that Rebecca so desperately loved to show off to her friends. Every single dollar I spent on that lavish party felt like swallowing crushed glass. I was funding a luxurious banquet for the exact people who were actively trying to destroy me. But I knew it was absolutely necessary. I had to lull them into a false sense of total security. I had to make them believe they had completely won the war. The ballroom was packed with over 200 people. The guest list was a strategic masterpiece of social theater. I invited the most prominent members of our local community. The church elders were there, wearing their finest tailored suits and shaking hands with local politicians. The top executives and regional managers from my commercial roofing and steel fabrication company were there mingling with wealthy business owners and local developers. And of course, Rebecca's entire family was there holding court, as if they were unquestioned royalty. I watched Rebecca glide across the polished mahogany dance floor in a stunning designer gown I had paid for with the sweat of my brow. She held her hand gently over her flat stomach, accepting the warm congratulations and polite smiles from our friends. She played the role of the devoted, adoring pregnant wife flawlessly. If I had not heard her mocking me on those hidden audio recordings just days prior, I might have actually believed the pure, innocent look in her eyes. I stood near the edge of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water tightly in my calloused hand. I watched my father-in-law Charles holding a crystal glass of expensive bourbon, laughing loudly with the church pastor. Charles looked incredibly smug and highly satisfied with himself. He truly believed his aggressive living room sermon had broken my will. He thought he had successfully bullied a tired old man into accepting his daughter's infidelity and covering up his son's federal crimes. Then I saw Derek. My financial controller was standing by the carved ice sculpture wearing a sharp, slim, tailored suit, looking like $1,000,000. He caught my eye across the crowded room and raised his glass to me in a silent, respectful toast. It took every single ounce of willpower I possessed not to walk across that polished floor and strangle him with my bare hands. He was standing in the very room I paid for drinking my alcohol, while carrying on a secret affair with my wife and embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from my business. He felt absolutely untouchable. Beside him was Greg, my lazy, arrogant brother-in-law. Greg was loudly bragging to one of my site managers about a recent expensive golf trip, completely oblivious to the fact that I knew his illegal gambling debts were being paid for with my stolen money. The psychological strain of maintaining my composure was agonizing. It was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my lungs. My jaw physically ached from forcing a pleasant, relaxed smile for hours on end. Every time someone patted me on the back and told me how lucky I was to have such a beautiful, loving family, I wanted to scream the absolute truth. I wanted to grab the microphone and tell the entire room that my wife was a manipulative fraud. I wanted to point at Derek and Greg and expose them as federal criminals who were robbing me blind. But I knew the federal prosecutors needed exactly one more week to secure the official arrest warrants and lock down the offshore banking records. If I tipped my hand even a fraction of an inch tonight, the entire trap would fall apart. Derek would empty the offshore accounts and flee the country. Rebecca would file for immediate divorce and use the family court system to drain my assets. I had to endure the profound humiliation. I had to play the pliable blind fool. Midway through the evening, the loud chatter of the ballroom began to settle down. It was time for the speeches. I walked slowly up to the small elevated stage at the front of the room. The bright spotlight hit my face, and the entire crowd turned their attention to me. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw my loyal employees, the men and women who had stood by my side in the grueling heat of the steel fabrication yard for decades. I saw my trusted friends. And right in the front row, I saw the pack of vultures waiting for their public validation. I tapped my spoon against my crystal glass, and the massive room fell completely silent. I leaned into the microphone and took a deep, shaky breath. I told the crowd that turning 65 was a profound moment of reflection for any man. I talked about my humble beginnings. I talked about starting my business with nothing but a rusted pickup truck, a dented toolbox, and a relentless desire to succeed. I thanked my incredible crew for their dedication and hard work over the years. And then I turned my eyes directly to Rebecca. She looked up at me with her hands clasped tightly together, putting on a display of absolute adoration. I forced my voice to crack with fake, overwhelming emotion. I told the room that the greatest blessing of my entire life was the gorgeous woman standing in the front row. I said that after all the hard work and all the long hours, I was finally being rewarded with something I never thought possible at my age. I announced to the entire room that my beautiful wife Rebecca was pregnant. The reaction was instantaneous. The ballroom erupted in massive, deafening applause. The church elders beamed with joy. My employees cheered and clapped enthusiastically. I raised my hand to quiet the room down. I looked right at Charles and Greg, and then I looked directly at Derek. I spoke clearly into the microphone, ensuring every single person heard my next words. I called the pregnancy an absolute miracle. I said it was a divine blessing that had completely revitalized my tired spirit. I told the crowd that this baby was the ultimate gift and that I was going to dedicate the rest of my life to providing for my growing family. Rebecca covered her mouth with her hands, pretending to wipe away tears of overwhelming joy. Charles puffed out his chest, looking incredibly proud of his masterful manipulation. Derek stood in the back of the crowd, smiling that arrogant, nasty little smile. He thought I was publicly claiming his child. He thought his master plan was completely flawless and that he had successfully secured his financial future using my name. The applause faded, and the party resumed with a renewed sense of vibrant celebration. People lined up to shake my hand and congratulate me. I accepted every single compliment with a warm, grateful nod. But the most important part of the night was still yet to come. I needed to set the final hook. I needed to ensure that Derek and Greg walked willingly into the slaughterhouse. As the evening began to wind down, I approached Rebecca, Charles, Greg, and Derek. I asked them to join me in the private VIP lounge, adjacent to the main ballroom. I told them I wanted to have a quiet, private toast with the people who meant the absolute most to my future. We walked into the small, dimly lit room, and I closed the heavy wooden door behind us, shutting out the loud music of the party. The five of us stood in a loose circle. I poured an expensive aged scotch into 5 glasses and handed them out. I looked at the 4 of them, letting a deep, heavy exhaustion show on my face. I sighed loudly and rubbed the back of my neck, playing the part of the weary, aging patriarch. I told them that standing on that stage tonight made me realize something very important. I told them that I was getting old. I said the grueling 12-hour shifts at the steel yard were finally taking their toll on my health, and that I wanted to be fully present to raise this new, miraculous baby. I looked directly at Greg and Derek. I told them that a man has to know when it is time to step back and pass the torch. I announced that I had made a definitive, absolute decision about the future of my $15 million company. I told them I was officially stepping down as the active chief executive officer. The room went dead silent. Rebecca gasped softly, her eyes wide with shock and greedy anticipation. I told them that I had already instructed my corporate attorneys to draft the final restructuring documents. I said that because family was the most important thing in the world to me, I was going to give Greg and Derek substantial equity shares in the business. I told them I wanted them to take over the daily corporate operations so I could retire in peace and focus entirely on my wife and my new child. I said the legal paperwork would be ready to sign next Friday afternoon in my corporate boardroom. I sold the lie with absolute perfection. I told them this was my way of securing the family's future and ensuring that the business remained in trusted, capable hands. The reaction was exactly what I had calculated. They swallowed the bait hook, line, and sinker. Charles raised his glass high into the air, his face flushed with arrogant triumph. He told me it was the smartest, most honorable decision a man could ever make. He actually had the nerve to tell me how incredibly proud he was to call me his son-in-law. Greg was practically vibrating with nervous excitement. He saw all his illegal offshore gambling debts completely vanishing. He saw unlimited corporate funds at his fingertips. He shook my hand vigorously, promising me that he would not let the family down. Derek stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with sheer, unadulterated greed. He clinked his glass against mine and told me it was a profound honor to help lead the company into a new, wealthy era. He thought he was about to inherit half of my company while sleeping with my wife right under my nose. We all drank the expensive scotch together. They smiled at each other, sharing secret victorious glances when they thought I was not looking. They thought they were brilliant criminal masterminds who had successfully robbed a blind old fool. They thought next Friday was going to be the greatest day of their lives. I smiled back at them, the cold iron certainty settling deep in my chest. I knew next Friday would indeed be a day they would never, ever forget. I just needed to play the pliable fool for 7 more days. The 7 days following my 65th birthday party were the longest, most excruciating days of my entire life. Every single morning, I woke up before the sun with a heavy tightening in my chest. I had to put on my work boots and my steel toe caps, knowing that I was walking into a building completely infested with parasites. I had to look at my brother-in-law, Greg, sitting at his desk online shopping for expensive golf clubs with money he thought he was about to officially inherit. I had to walk past my financial controller, Derek, who would smile his slick, arrogant smile and hand me daily operational reports that were built on a foundation of absolute lies. And every evening, I had to return to a sprawling suburban home to sit across the dining room table from a woman who was actively trying to destroy my life. Rebecca was in a state of pure euphoric bliss. She spent her days ordering expensive organic baby clothes and browsing high-end catalogs for luxury nursery furniture. She would sit in the living room, rubbing her stomach, talking endlessly about how our family was finally complete. She would reach across the table and squeeze my calloused hand, thanking me for being such a strong, forgiving, and generous husband. The sheer volume of her hypocrisy made my stomach churn with violent physical disgust. I had to force myself to breathe slowly and evenly. I had to bury my burning rage deep down inside my gut and cover it with a mask of weary compliance. I played the part of the tired old steelworker perfectly. I let her believe she had completely won. But while she was busy planning her future on a sunny Florida beach, I was busy planning her absolute destruction. On Tuesday morning, I told Rebecca I had a long off-site meeting with a commercial roofing materials supplier. Instead, I drove my heavy work truck straight to downtown Columbus. I parked in the secure underground garage and took the private elevator up to the 40th floor to meet with my corporate attorney, Robert. When I walked into his expansive corner office, Robert was not alone. Sitting around his massive mahogany conference table were three men in sharp, dark suits. They were agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The lead agent introduced himself as Special Agent Harrison. He was a serious, unsmiling man with sharp, calculating eyes. Robert had already handed over the initial forensic audit we had conducted the week prior. Agent Harrison laid out the severity of the situation in cold, clinical terms. He told me that this was not a simple case of localized corporate theft. Because Derek had set up dummy vendor accounts and funneled my money through out-of-state shell corporations, it automatically triggered federal jurisdiction. But the crime escalated significantly when the funds were wired out of the country to offshore gambling syndicates in the Caribbean to cover Greg's massive debts. Agent Harrison explained that this constituted federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and international money laundering. He said the paper trail my forensic accountants had uncovered was absolutely flawless. The digital signatures matched perfectly. The banking routing numbers were completely verified. Derek and Greg had left a massive, glowing digital footprint. Agent Harrison looked me directly in the eye and told me that the men who had stolen $420,000 from my business were looking at decades in a federal penitentiary. I sat in that heavy leather chair feeling a profound sense of vindication. I told Agent Harrison about the upcoming meeting on Friday. I explained that I had lured them into a false sense of absolute security by promising to sign over equity shares in my $15 million company. I told the agents that all the key players would be sitting together in one single room, expecting a massive payout. Agent Harrison nodded slowly, his face hardening into a look of deep professional satisfaction. He told me that his team would coordinate with the local district attorney to secure the final sealed arrest warrants. They would be waiting in the parking lot of my steel fabrication yard on Friday afternoon, ready to execute a coordinated tactical raid the very second I gave the signal. The federal crimes would take care of Derek and Greg, but I needed one final, irrefutable piece of evidence to completely obliterate Rebecca. I already had my medical records proving my vasectomy from 15 years ago. I knew with absolute scientific certainty that I was completely sterile and the child she was carrying was not mine. But I knew how manipulative Rebecca and her father Charles could be. If I only presented my medical records, they would try to spin a new web of lies. They would claim it was a medical miracle, or they would try to blame a random anonymous stranger to protect Derek and keep the corporate embezzlement separate from the affair. I needed to tie the affair directly to the corporate fraud. I needed to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the man stealing from my business was the exact same man sleeping with my wife. I needed Derek's genetic profile. On Wednesday afternoon, I walked into the main employee break room at the fabrication yard. The room was empty except for Derek, who was standing by the large commercial coffee machine. He was wearing his usual tailored suit, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He was holding a clear plastic water bottle. I walked over to the refrigerator and made casual small talk with him. I asked him if he was ready for the big meeting on Friday. Derek smiled broadly, showing his bright white teeth. He told me he was absolutely ready to take the company to the next level and relieve me of my heavy burdens. He took a long drink from his water bottle, screwed the plastic cap back on, and tossed it carelessly into the recycling bin before walking out of the break room with a smug, arrogant wave. The moment the door closed behind him, I moved with total precision. I pulled a clean plastic evidence bag and a pair of latex gloves from my jacket pocket. I reached into the recycling bin and carefully extracted the plastic water bottle he had just discarded. I sealed it tightly inside the bag without touching the rim. I walked straight out the back door of the building and got into my truck. I drove to a highly discreet private medical laboratory on the other side of the city. I had arranged the appointment through my attorney, Robert. I handed the sealed bag over to the senior lab technician and paid a premium fee in cash for an expedited genetic extraction. I told them I did not need a full paternity test right now, because the baby was not even born yet. I simply needed a certified, verified genetic baseline profile of the man who drank from that bottle. The technician assured me I would have the certified documents in my hands by Thursday evening. It was the final nail in their collective coffin. When the baby was eventually born, I would force a court-ordered paternity test and match it perfectly to Derek's profile. There would be absolutely no escape. No room for lies, no room for manipulation. Thursday night arrived heavy with the weight of impending justice. Rebecca had gone to sleep early, complaining of pregnancy fatigue. The house was completely silent. I walked into my private home office and locked the heavy, solid oak door. I closed the thick wooden blinds and turned on the bright brass lamp on my desk. It was time to assemble the ultimate weapons of their destruction. I had 4 thick, heavy-duty black binders sitting on my desk. One for Rebecca, one for her arrogant father, Charles, one for her gambling-addicted brother, Greg, and one for my treacherous financial comptroller, Derek. I moved methodically, my calloused hands sorting the stacks of paper with absolute care. I created distinct organized sections within each binder using thick red plastic dividers. I wanted this to be as clear and devastating as possible. In the very first section of the binders, I placed the printed transcripts of the hidden audio recordings. I had spent hours typing out every single agonizing word they had spoken. I printed the conversation where Derek and Rebecca laughed at me for being a blind, pathetic old workhorse. I printed the exact quotes where they gleefully planned to use my hard-earned wealth to buy a luxury beachfront estate in Florida. I highlighted the specific paragraphs where Rebecca admitted she was going to use the child welfare loophole to break our prenuptial agreement and legally steal half of my $15 million company. In the second section, I inserted the complete forensic accounting report. It was a masterpiece of financial investigation. There were high-resolution copies of the fake vendor invoices created by Derek. There were detailed flowcharts tracing the stolen $420,000 from my corporate operating accounts directly into the Caribbean offshore gambling accounts owned by Greg. I included the verified digital signatures that proved Derek had authorized every single fraudulent wire transfer. It was an undeniable roadmap of their federal crimes. In the third section, I placed my medical history. I inserted the certified documents from my doctor detailing my irreversible vasectomy from 15 years ago. Right next to my medical records, I placed the expedited genetic profile I had just received from the private lab confirming the DNA extracted from Derek's water bottle. I typed a clear, bold statement on the following page, declaring my demand for a mandatory court-ordered paternity test upon the birth of the child. The narrative of the miraculous baby was completely dead and buried. In the fourth and final section of the binders, I placed the ultimate kill shot. I inserted a pristine, high-quality copy of the prenuptial agreement Rebecca and I had signed 12 years ago. I took a bright yellow marker and highlighted the entire 7th section of the contract. The absolute fraud and moral turpitude clause. The clause explicitly stated that any spouse found participating in financial fraud or corporate theft against the primary estate immediately and permanently forfeits all rights to any marital assets, including alimony and corporate equity. I finished assembling the files and closed the heavy covers of the 4 black binders. The loud, sharp snap of the metal rings echoed in the quiet office, like the sound of a closing prison cell. I ran my hands over the smooth, dark covers. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace wash over my tired, aching body. I had spent my entire life building structures out of steel to withstand the harshest storms. But these 4 binders were the strongest things I had ever built. They were completely fireproof, bulletproof, and utterly devastating. I packed the binders carefully into my leather briefcase and locked it with a combination dial. I turned off the brass lamp and sat in the dark office for a long time, simply listening to the quiet breathing of the house. Tomorrow afternoon, I was going to walk into my corporate boardroom. My wife, her father, her brother, and my financial controller would all be sitting around the polished mahogany table, wearing their finest clothes and their brightest, most arrogant smiles. They would be holding expensive pens, waiting eagerly to sign documents they believed would hand them millions of dollars of my hard-earned money. They thought they had entirely broken me. They thought they had successfully manipulated my Christian faith and my fear of public scandal to secure their luxurious futures. But tomorrow I was not going to hand them equity shares. I was going to hand them these black binders. I was going to look them dead in the eye and detonate their entire world. I smiled in the darkness, a cold, hard smile. The wait was finally over. The execution was completely prepared. Friday afternoon finally arrived. The sky over the Ohio steel yard was a brilliant, piercing blue. It was the kind of crisp, clear day that usually made me feel incredibly grateful to be alive. But today, it felt like the perfect backdrop for absolute destruction. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my executive boardroom. I looked out over the sprawling complex I had built with 40 years of sweat blood and broken fingernails. I watched the heavy yellow cranes lifting massive steel beams. I heard the distant rhythmic pounding of the fabrication machines. This was my empire. This was my sanctuary. And today, I was going to purge the parasites that had infected it. My hands rested on the cool, smooth mahogany wood of the long conference table. At each of the 4 seats arranged opposite my chair, I had placed a single thick black binder. There were no pens. There were no corporate restructuring contracts. There were no equity shares waiting to be signed. There was only the cold, hard, undeniable truth. I thought about the sheer agonizing psychological torture I had endured over the past week. Every single smile I had forced. Every single nod of compliance I had given Rebecca as she talked about our beautiful future together. I had swallowed my pride and played the pathetic, pliable old fool just to get them all into this room at the exact same time. The physical toll had been massive. My chest had ached constantly. My sleep had been non-existent. But standing here now, looking at those 4 black binders, I felt a surge of energy I had not felt since I was a young man swinging a hammer on the production floor. The trap was perfectly set. The federal agents were already positioned in unmarked vehicles just outside the main gates of the fabrication yard, waiting for my signal. But before they stormed the building to make the arrests, I needed this moment. I needed to look these people in the eye and watch their arrogant illusions shatter into a million irreparable pieces. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy wooden doors of my office suite swung open. I heard their voices before I saw them. They were laughing. It was that loud, confident, entitled laughter of people who believed they had completely conquered the world. I turned away from the window and watched them walk into the boardroom. They looked like they were arriving at a royal coronation. Rebecca walked in first. She was wearing a stunning, expensive white designer dress that clung to her flat stomach. She had spent the entire morning at an upscale salon getting her hair and makeup done perfectly. She looked radiant and victorious. She immediately walked over to me and kissed my rough cheek, telling me how incredibly proud she was of me. She said this was the beginning of our wonderful new life together. I forced myself to smile back at her and patted her arm gently. Right behind her was her father, Charles. Charles wore a sharp gray custom suit. He walked with his chest puffed out, an unlit premium cigar held loosely between his fingers. He walked up to me and clapped me hard on the shoulder. He loudly proclaimed that today was a historic day for the family, and that my legacy would be forever secured by my generous and honorable actions. He thought his manipulative living room speech had broken me into complete submission. He thought he was the master puppeteer pulling the strings of a tired old workhorse. I thanked him politely and directed him to a seat at the table. Then came my brother-in-law, Greg. Greg was wearing a brand new blue polo shirt and a flashy gold watch he probably bought on credit, assuming he would be a millionaire by the end of the day. He was practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. He smirked at me and said he was ready to step up and take the heavy burdens off my shoulders. And finally Derek walked into the room. My trusted financial comptroller, the man who had been sleeping in my bed and embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from my company. Derek wore a flawless dark navy suit with a crisp white shirt and a solid silk tie. His hair was slicked back perfectly. He looked at me with that signature arrogant smirk. He actually had the unbelievable audacity to reach out and shake my hand, telling me that he was deeply honored by my trust and that he would manage my company with the utmost integrity. I gripped his soft, manicured hand firmly and looked him dead in the eye. I told him I was absolutely certain he would get exactly what he deserved today. The four of them moved toward the long mahogany conference table. They took their seats, chatting excitedly among themselves. They were so blinded by their own greed and arrogance that they did not even notice the unusual atmosphere in the room. They did not notice that there was no champagne to celebrate. They did not notice that my corporate attorney was completely absent. And they did not immediately comprehend the significance of the 4 thick black binders sitting directly in front of them. They just assumed the binders contained the complicated legal paperwork required to transfer millions of dollars in equity shares into their names. I walked slowly over to the heavy double doors of the boardroom. I pushed them completely shut. The loud, solid click of the heavy brass locks echoing in the quiet room sounded exactly like a prison cell slamming shut. I turned around and walked to the head of the table. I did not sit down. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, and my hands resting flat on the polished wood. The room slowly grew quiet as they finally noticed my silence. The festive atmosphere began to drain away, replaced by a sudden creeping tension. Charles cleared his throat and asked me where my lawyers were and if we should wait for them to begin signing the documents. Rebecca smiled sweetly and asked me if everything was all right. She asked why I looked so serious on such a happy day. I looked at the 4 faces staring back at me. 4 vultures who had circled my life, waiting for me to die so they could feast on my 40 years of hard labor. I took a deep, slow breath. I told them there were no corporate lawyers coming today. I told them there were no restructuring documents. I told them there were absolutely no equity shares to sign over. A heavy, profound silence fell over the boardroom. The arrogant smiles on their faces began to falter, slipping into expressions of genuine confusion. Greg nervously tapped his fingers on the table and asked me what I was talking about. He asked if there was some sort of delay with the bank. Derek narrowed his eyes, observing my posture with a sudden sharp suspicion. He was a calculating man, and he finally realized that something was horribly wrong. Charles frowned deeply and adopted his authoritative, commanding tone. He demanded to know what kind of game I was playing and reminded me that we had a solid agreement to secure the future of the family. I ignored Charles completely. I turned my gaze directly to my wife. I looked into Rebecca's eyes, the eyes that had faked tears on my kitchen floor. The eyes that had looked at me with manufactured devotion while she planned my total ruin behind my back. I told Rebecca to open the black binder in front of her. She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. She asked me what was inside. I commanded her in a voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation to open the binder immediately. She slowly peeled back the dark, heavy cover and flipped to the very first section. I told the room that for the past week I had listened to a lot of beautiful speeches about family loyalty miracles and Christian forgiveness. But I said it was finally time to talk about the absolute truth. I told Rebecca to look at the documents sitting right on top of the stack. She looked down at those papers, and her face instantly drained of all color. Her skin turned a sickly, ghostly white. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. Charles leaned over to look at what she was reading, and his entire body went rigidly stiff. Sitting inside that binder were the certified medical records from my personal physician. It was the undeniable documented proof of the irreversible vasectomy I had undergone exactly 15 years ago. I spoke to Rebecca in a slow, cold, deliberate voice. I told her that I knew the pregnancy was real, but I also knew with absolute scientific certainty that it was physically impossible for me to be the father of her child. I watched her perfectly constructed world shatter in real time. The brilliant, flawless actress who had manipulated my emotions for weeks was completely paralyzed. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with pure, absolute terror. She tried to form a sentence. She tried to stammer out an excuse. She whispered my name in a high, thin, fragile voice, begging me to let her explain. She tried to say it was a mistake or a medical anomaly, but the lie died in her throat. She knew I had her entirely cornered. The foundation of her entire criminal plot, the miraculous baby she intended to use as a legal weapon, was instantly destroyed. The boardroom was completely suffocated by the heavy, toxic weight of the revelation. Greg sat frozen in his chair, his eyes darting back and forth between his sister and the medical records. Charles gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles white, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He realized that the leverage he thought he held over me was completely gone. His grand, manipulative speech had been built on a lie, and I had known it the entire time. But I was not finished. The demolition had only just begun. I turned my attention away from my trembling wife and locked my eyes directly onto Derek. My financial controller was sitting rigidly in his chair. The color had completely vanished from his face. The slick, arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by the panicked realization of a trapped animal. I looked him dead in the eye and let the cold, absolute silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment. Then I leaned forward, resting my knuckles on the table. I spoke to Derek in a quiet, deadly calm voice. I told him that since the baby could not possibly be mine, I felt it was only right to properly congratulate the actual father. I told him to open his binder. Derek did not move. His hands were shaking so violently he had to press them flat against his thighs to stop the trembling. I yelled at him to open the binder. He flinched and awkwardly flipped open the heavy black cover. I told him to look at the second page. I told the entire room that I did not want to leave anything up to chance or imagination. I explained that earlier this week I had collected a plastic water bottle Derek had thrown away in the employee break room. I told them I took that bottle to a private accelerated genetics laboratory downtown. I pointed at the certified documents resting under Derek's shaking hands. I announced to the room that the DNA profile extracted from his water bottle was safely filed away, and the very moment that baby was born, I would force a mandatory court-ordered paternity test. I told Derek that the child Rebecca was carrying, the child they planned to use to legally rob me blind, was his. The sheer, unadulterated terror that washed over Derek's face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the trapdoor open beneath his feet. He realized that I did not just know about the affair. I knew everything. I knew they had been sleeping together in my house. I knew they had been mocking my age and my work ethic on their secret phone calls. He slowly looked over at Rebecca, and then back at me, his breathing shallow and rapid. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked into a pathetic whimper. He told me I was crazy, and that I was making a terrible mistake. He tried to deny it, but the undeniable certified medical proof was sitting right in front of him. The entire room descended into absolute chaos. Charles stood up from his chair, shouting at me that this was an outrage and that I had no right to treat his daughter this way. Greg started yelling, denying any knowledge of the affair, trying desperately to distance himself from the explosion. Rebecca buried her face in her hands and began sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect makeup running down her pale cheeks. But Derek remained completely silent. He stared down at the binder, his chest heaving, his mind frantically trying to find an escape route. But there was no escape. I stood at the head of the table feeling like a towering mountain of unbreakable steel. I looked at the four of them thrashing and panicking in the trap they had built with their own greed. I raised my hand and slammed my palm down hard on the solid mahogany table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot, instantly silencing their chaotic shouting. I looked at Charles and Greg and told them to sit down and shut their mouths. I told them the medical records and the paternity test were just the introduction. I told them the real reason I brought them into this locked room was waiting in the next section of their binders. I told them it was time to talk about the missing $420,000. I stood at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, watching the exact moment the oxygen completely left the room. The words $420,000 hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Derek was staring at the thick black binder in front of him as if it were a live explosive device. His perfectly slicked back hair suddenly looked greasy, and his expensive tailored suit could not hide the violent trembling of his shoulders. Greg was breathing rapidly, his eyes darting frantically toward the locked double doors of the boardroom. He looked exactly like a cornered rat, realizing there was absolutely no way out of the trap. Charles was a man who had spent his entire life bullying people into total submission. He relied heavily on his loud, booming voice and his prominent community status to crush any opposition. He was not used to losing control. Charles slammed his manicured fist onto the table and pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He told me I was completely out of my mind. He yelled that I had no right to make these wild, offensive accusations, and that I was simply a bitter, jealous old man making up insane stories to avoid my responsibilities. Charles loudly declared that this marriage was officially over. He puffed out his chest and paced behind Rebecca's chair, proudly telling me that because Rebecca was pregnant, and because I had been emotionally abusive by locking them in this room, a family court judge would completely destroy me. Charles boasted that Rebecca would take exactly half of my $15 million company. He said she would take the sprawling suburban house, the luxury cars, and demand permanent exorbitant alimony to ensure the welfare of her unborn child. Charles told me that my prenuptial agreement was a worthless piece of paper that would be instantly invalidated by the court. Hearing her father's loud defense, Rebecca sat up a little straighter. A small fraction of her arrogant confidence suddenly returned. She wiped the running makeup from her pale cheeks and looked at me with a cold, spiteful glare. She actually nodded along with her father, deeply believing that the child welfare loophole was still her impenetrable legal shield. She told me I was going to pay dearly for humiliating her in front of her family. I did not argue with them. I did not raise my voice to match Charles. I simply looked past them toward the heavy frosted glass door of my private adjoining office. I nodded my head once. The door clicked open, and my corporate attorney Robert stepped into the boardroom. Robert wore a dark charcoal suit and carried a single manila folder. He walked with the calm, steady authority of a man who held all the winning cards in his hand. Charles stopped yelling instantly. He knew exactly who Robert was. Everyone in the local business community knew Robert was the most ruthless and highly effective corporate litigator in the entire state. Robert walked slowly to the head of the table and stood right beside me. He did not smile. He looked down at Charles and Rebecca with an expression of absolute clinical disgust. Robert opened his manila folder and pulled out the original copy of my 12-year-old prenuptial agreement. He cleared his throat, and his voice cut through the silent room like a freshly sharpened blade. He addressed Rebecca directly. He told her that she was completely correct about one specific thing. He said family court judges often invalidate standard prenuptial agreements when a pregnancy is involved to protect the welfare of the child. Rebecca smiled, a wicked, victorious smile, thinking my own attorney was actually agreeing with her legal strategy. But then Robert raised his hand and told her to listen very carefully to what he had to say next. Robert explained that the contract we had signed 12 years ago was absolutely not a standard generic agreement. He flipped to the 7th section of the heavy document and read the highlighted text aloud. He read the absolute fraud and moral turpitude clause. His voice was loud and clear, echoing off the massive glass walls of the boardroom. He explained that this specific legal clause explicitly stated that any spouse found actively participating in corporate theft, financial fraud, or sabotage against the primary estate immediately and permanently forfeits all rights to any and all marital assets. Robert looked Rebecca directly in the eye. He told her that she did not just have a simple physical affair with my employee. By providing a false alibi for Derek and Greg during their fraudulent activities, and by knowingly covering up their corporate embezzlement, she had officially become a willing accessory to a massive federal crime. Robert placed the document flat on the mahogany table. He leaned forward and told Rebecca that a family court judge will never award alimony or corporate equity to a spouse who is actively under federal investigation for defrauding the exact company she is desperately trying to divide. Robert told her in a cold voice, completely devoid of any pity, that her clever child welfare loophole was entirely obliterated. He explicitly stated that she would be walking away from this 12-year marriage with exactly $0 and 0 cents. She would not get the suburban house. She would not get a single share of my business. She would not get a monthly financial allowance. She was entirely, completely, and hopelessly ruined. The remaining color drained entirely from Rebecca's face. The wicked, victorious smile vanished completely, replaced by a look of profound, absolute horror. She looked up at her father for help, but Charles was completely silent. His mouth was slightly open, but he could not find a single word to say. The invincible, arrogant patriarch was completely paralyzed. He realized his beautiful daughter was not going to be a wealthy, divorced socialite living in luxury. She was going to be a penniless, disgraced woman facing a serious criminal investigation. I turned my attention away from my ruined wife and looked directly at Derek and Greg. Greg was sweating profusely. Large, wet patches stained his brand-new blue polo shirt. He was gripping the arms of his leather chair so tightly his knuckles were completely white. Derek was staring blindly at the table, his chest heaving, his mind desperately trying to calculate a way out of the locked room. I told them to open the next section of their black binders. I told them it was time to thoroughly review their magnificent financial handiwork. I walked slowly around the long conference table. I spoke clearly, detailing every single step of their criminal conspiracy. I told them about the elite forensic accounting firm I had secretly brought in from Columbus under the disguise of a tax audit. I told them how the auditors had restricted Derek's server permissions and traced every single dummy vendor invoice he had created over the past 36 months. I walked behind Derek's chair and told him I knew exactly how he had funneled $420,000 of my money out of the corporate operating budget. Then, I walked behind Greg's chair. I placed my heavy hands on the back of his seat and told him I knew exactly where the stolen money went. I told the room about the offshore Caribbean banking accounts. I told them about Greg's massive, uncontrollable sports betting and illegal gambling addiction. I looked at Charles, who was staring blankly at the floor. I told Charles I knew exactly why he had given me that ridiculous, manipulative speech about Christian forgiveness and stepping up to be a man. He knew his son was drowning in illegal gambling debt, and he knew Derek was stealing my money to keep Greg out of a federal prison. The entire family had conspired to use me as a blind, compliant bank vault. They had traded my dignity, my business, and my life to protect their own selfish, greedy interests. They had all been completely complicit in robbing me blind while sitting at my dinner table and drinking my expensive wine. Derek suddenly stood up. His heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with wild animal panic. He told Greg they needed to leave immediately. He said they needed to call their own defense lawyers and that they did not have to listen to another word of this insane accusation. Greg jumped up from his seat, almost tripping over his own feet in his desperate haste. They moved quickly toward the locked double doors of the boardroom, intending to run. They truly thought they could simply walk out of my building, empty their bank accounts, and disappear before I could take the forensic audit to the local police department. I did not try to stop them. I simply stayed standing at the head of the conference table and crossed my arms over my chest. I called out to Derek and told him he was making a very serious mistake. I told him he really needed to look out the window before he tried to open that door. Derek froze. He slowly turned his head and looked through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the front parking lot of the steel fabrication yard. The afternoon sun was shining brightly on the wet pavement, but the parking lot was no longer empty. 3 large, black, unmarked sport utility vehicles had quietly pulled through the main gates. They were parked in a tight, angled formation, completely blocking Derek's luxury sedan and Greg's car. I watched Derek's face closely as the doors of the black vehicles swung open. Over a dozen men and women wearing heavy tactical vests with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across their backs stepped out onto the pavement. They were accompanied by several marked local police cruisers, their red and blue lights flashing silently in the bright afternoon daylight. I spoke into the absolute stunned silence of the boardroom. I told Derek that because he used out-of-state shell corporations and wired stolen funds to international offshore gambling syndicates, his little embezzlement scheme was no longer a local matter. I told him it was a massive federal crime. I explained that my attorney Robert had hand-delivered the complete forensic audit and the hidden audio recordings to the federal prosecutor 3 days ago. They had already verified the offshore routing numbers. They had already secured the sealed federal arrest warrants. There was absolutely nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The heavy wooden double doors of the boardroom suddenly clicked unlocked from the outside. The doors swung open violently, and 4 armed federal agents stepped into the room, followed closely by 2 local police officers. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man, stepped forward and identified himself. He looked directly at Derek and Greg. He loudly announced that they were both under arrest for federal wire fraud, grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. The agents moved with swift, practiced efficiency. They grabbed Derek, twisting his arms firmly behind his back. Derek did not fight. He simply went completely limp, his arrogant facade entirely shattered into pieces. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed loudly in the quiet room. He looked pathetic, his expensive tailored suit bunching up awkwardly as the agents secured him. Greg completely panicked. He started crying instantly, sobbing loudly like a small, frightened child. He begged his father to do something to help him. He pleaded with the federal agents, telling them it was all Derek's idea and that he did not want to go to prison. The agents completely ignored his pathetic whining, snapping the heavy handcuffs around his wrists and forcefully guiding him toward the doorway. I looked back at the conference table. The scene of absolute destruction was complete. Charles had collapsed heavily into his leather chair. His face was buried deep in his trembling hands. The proud, wealthy patriarch was utterly ruined. His only son was going to a federal penitentiary. His daughter was facing a massive criminal investigation and total financial ruin. His perfect community reputation was completely destroyed. He would be known forever as the man who tried to cover up a federal crime to steal from his own son-in-law. He looked small, weak, and entirely broken. Rebecca was hyperventilating. She slid out of her chair and dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor. She crawled toward me, her expensive white designer dress pooling around her legs. She reached out and grabbed the fabric of my trousers. She was weeping hysterically, her makeup completely ruined, her face twisted in pure, desperate agony. She begged me to forgive her. She screamed that she was sorry and that she had made a terrible mistake. She pleaded with me to remember the 12 years we had spent together. She said she loved me and that we could still be a family. She realized in one single horrifying instant that she had lost absolutely everything. She had lost her comfortable marriage, her wealthy husband, her secret lover, her guaranteed financial future, and her entire family in one fell swoop. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering sadness. I reached down and calmly but firmly removed her grasping hands from my legs. I looked her directly in the eyes one final time. I told her that she had made her choice the very moment she decided to use my life as a bank account. I told her I was completely done with her lies. I turned my back on her, leaving her sobbing uncontrollably on the boardroom floor. I walked toward the open double doors. My heavy steel-toed boots echoed loudly on the polished hardwood floor, creating a steady, rhythmic sound of absolute finality. I walked past the federal agents, past the handcuffed criminals, and out into the bright, clean air of the steel yard, leaving the wreckage of their greedy lives completely behind me. A year has passed since that Friday afternoon in the boardroom. The heavy iron chains that used to crush my chest are completely gone. Today, the Ohio sky is a brilliant, clear blue, and the air smells like fresh rain and blooming oak trees. I am standing in the exact same spot by the massive glass windows of my executive office, looking out over the steel fabrication yard. But everything looks different now. The yard is buzzing with energy. The yellow cranes are lifting massive steel trusses high into the air, and the rhythmic pounding of the machinery sounds like a heartbeat. It is the heartbeat of a healthy, thriving company that has finally been cured of a deadly disease. The parasites have been completely burned away, and the structure I built with 40 years of sweat and blood stands stronger than ever before. The federal justice system moves with a slow, relentless, crushing weight. Derek and Greg found that out the hard way. Their trial was swift and absolutely merciless. The forensic accounting report and the digital paper trail were so perfectly documented that their defense attorneys had absolutely no room to maneuver. The prosecutors laid out every single dummy invoice and every offshore wire transfer in excruciating detail. They tried to turn on each other in the courtroom. Greg sobbed on the witness stand, claiming Derek had manipulated his gambling addiction. Derek pointed the finger right back, claiming Greg had threatened him with his dangerous underground connections. But the judge did not care about their pathetic excuses. They were both found guilty of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and grand larceny. Derek was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary for being the primary architect of the theft. Greg received 8 years for his active participation and international money laundering. I was sitting in the front row of the courtroom on the day they were sentenced. I watched the heavy steel doors close behind them. The arrogant, slick smirk was permanently erased from Derek's face. Greg looked like a terrified, broken child. They had tried to steal my life, and instead they threw away their own freedom. The fallout for Rebecca was just as devastating, though her prison was built out of her own shattered illusions and overwhelming greed. When the prenuptial agreement was officially upheld by the family court, she walked away with exactly $0 and 0 cents. The child welfare loophole she had bragged about on those hidden recordings was completely invalidated by her active documented participation in the corporate fraud. The judge looked at her with absolute disgust and denied every single one of her requests for alimony, temporary support, and corporate assets. Today, Rebecca lives in a cramped, run-down apartment complex on the very edge of the county line. The pristine, white luxury sport utility vehicle I bought her in cash was repossessed to cover her massive legal fees. The expensive designer gowns and the high society country club luncheons are nothing more than distant, bitter memories. She works 40 hours a week as a cashier at a local retail store, standing on her tired feet all day, scanning barcodes just to afford basic groceries and monthly rent. She is a single mother, raising Derek's child entirely on her own. There are no sunny Florida beaches in her future. There are no millions of dollars waiting in a Caribbean bank account. She spends her nights in a tiny, humid apartment, realizing that she traded a life of comfort and respect for a life of grueling poverty, all because she thought she could outsmart a tired old steel worker. I do not feel an ounce of pity for her. She made her bed with lies, deception, and malice, and now she has to sleep in it every single night for the rest of her life. Her father Charles suffered a fate far worse than simple poverty. For a man who cared about nothing more than his public image and his elevated community status, the absolute public destruction of his reputation was a fatal psychological blow. The lurid details of the federal trial became public record. The entire town learned how Charles had orchestrated that manipulative ambush in my living room. They learned how he had tried to force me to accept an illegitimate child using my Christian faith as a weapon just to cover up his son's federal crimes. He was completely exposed as a hypocritical fraud. The church elders who used to shake his hand and ask for his guidance politely asked him to step down from the parish council. The wealthy business owners and local politicians who used to attend his lavish dinner parties stopped returning his phone calls entirely. He became a total pariah in the community he loved so deeply. He rarely leaves his large empty house now. The proud, arrogant patriarch who marched into my home and commanded me to swallow my pride is now a lonely, isolated old man hiding behind his drawn curtains. His entire legacy is completely ruined. As for me, I am thriving in ways I never thought possible. The betrayal cut me incredibly deep. It was a vicious, painful wound that took months to properly heal. I had to learn how to sleep again without waking up in a cold sweat. I had to learn how to trust my own instincts again. But the fire of that absolute truth forged me into a much stronger man. I did not step down from my company, but I did step back. I realized that I had spent too much time trusting the wrong people with my corporate empire. I completely cleaned house. I promoted the loyal, hard-working men and women who had been sweating on the fabrication floor for decades. I put my top site managers into executive leadership roles. They are honest, blue-collar people who know the true value of $1 and the true meaning of hard work. The company is more profitable now than it has ever been because it is run by people who actually care about the steel they are forging and the roofs they are building. With the right people running the daily operations, I finally have the time to enjoy the life I sacrificed so much to build. I bought a small, quiet cabin on a beautiful, secluded lake 3 hours north of the city. I spend my weekends out on the water casting a fishing line into the still morning mist, listening to the wind rustle through the tall pine trees. There is no one there to lie to me. There is no one there plotting behind my back. It is just pure, absolute peace. I also built a large, detached garage on my property and started restoring classic vintage cars. I spend my evenings out there with motor oil on my hands and old rock and roll playing on the radio, bringing rusted, broken engines back to roaring life. It reminds me of my younger days when life was simple, straightforward, and honest. Sometimes when I am sitting alone on the wooden porch of my cabin drinking a hot cup of black coffee, I reflect on everything that happened over the last year. I think about the profound, agonizing psychological pain of discovering that the woman I loved and the family I trusted were nothing more than greedy vultures waiting for me to die. It is a terrifying, chilling thing to realize that pure evil can sleep right next to you in your own bed, hiding behind a sweet smile. But I do not let that darkness consume my spirit. I realize that the pain was a necessary crucible. Just like raw, ugly iron has to be thrust into a blazing furnace, melted down and beaten heavily with a hammer to become unbreakable steel, my spirit had to be severely tested by that betrayal to realize its true absolute strength. I survived the ambush. I found the massive leak in the roof, and I tore it out completely down to the very foundation. I am 66 years old now, and as I look out over the calm waters of the lake, I know with absolute certainty that I have never felt more alive. The silence of my home is no longer a heavy, oppressive weight. It is a comforting blanket. When I walk through the halls of my house, I no longer feel the presence of deceit. I sold the massive mahogany dining table where they used to sit and mock me. I replaced it with a simple, sturdy oak table that I built with my own 2 hands. Every meal I eat now tastes like absolute freedom. I have reconnected with old friends from my early days in the steel industry, men who know what it means to work a 14-hour shift and come home with an aching back. We sit on my porch, sharing stories and laughing loudly without a single worry in the world. I learned that you cannot buy genuine loyalty, and you certainly cannot marry into it if the foundation is built on greed. True loyalty is earned through mutual respect and shared hardship. My life is no longer filled with expensive country club brunches or fake charity galas. It is filled with the simple, profound joys of a life lived truthfully. I look at my calloused hands, and I am proud of every single scar. They are the hands that built an empire, the hands that uncovered a massive conspiracy, and the hands that finally set me free. If there is one profound lesson to be taken from this entire ordeal, it is this: kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. When you build your life with your own two hands from the ground up, you learn the value of patience and endurance. You learn how to weather the storm. But you also must learn that you can never let anyone tear down your life's work with lies and manipulation. There will always be people in this world who look at your success and believe they are entitled to it. There will always be vultures circling waiting for you to show a moment of fatigue or vulnerability so they can swoop in and feast. They will use your faith, your love, and your sense of duty against you. They will try to make you feel guilty for their own personal failures. But you have to stand firm. You have to trust your gut when something feels wrong. Do not close your eyes to the leak in the roof just because you are afraid of the rain. Face the storm head on. Gather your evidence. Silently act intelligently and strike back with absolute overwhelming precision. Justice is not something that is simply handed to you. It is something you have to actively demand, and sometimes it is something you have to forge yourself. The truth is the absolute sharpest weapon a man can wield, and when it is finally unleashed, it cuts through every single lie, every single excuse, and every single deceitful smile. Do not ever let anyone make you a prisoner in the life you worked so incredibly hard to build. You deserve peace, and you deserve respect. Never apologize for protecting what is rightfully yours, and never let the fear of being alone keep you tied to people who do not have your best interests at heart. The peace that comes from removing toxic, manipulative people from your life is worth far more than any amount of money. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. Drop a comment below telling me what city you are watching from and what time it is right now. It brings a lot of joy to this old steel framer's heart to know how far these stories travel and to connect with good, honest, hard-working people all around the world. Your support means absolutely everything to me, and it helps me keep sharing these important life lessons. Share your own personal experiences in the comments if you have ever had to stand up for yourself against people who tried to take advantage of your kindness or your hard work. We can all learn from each other and draw true strength from our shared struggles. Stay strong, protect your peace, keep working hard, and never let anyone extinguish your light. Until next time, God bless.